A cortege of carriages was traveling up the snow-covered mountainside. It traveled slowly and heavily, for the roads were covered with too thick a layer of snow. This was no ordinary cortege. The carriage doors were decorated with an iconic coat of arms, and it was the coat of arms of the kingdom of Charlemagne. And in that carriage rode a young princess of this kingdom. She was on her way to meet her future, and now she was in a carriage amidst the snowy mountains. She was lost in speculation. She was not alone in the carriage. She was accompanied by two men. They were not old men, and the hardships of the long journey were not easy for them. The silence in the carriage was broken by the grumbling of one of the attendants. He was wrapped in a shawl, shivering with cold and complaining of the merciless people and the misfortune that had befallen them. But the young princess, smiling, replied, turning to the thieving attendant, that it was not thunder but the most ordinary snow. It was the young princess of Charlemagne, the blue-eyed Canola Incana Charlemagne. But Oscar, who was accompanying her, again grudgingly objected that it was not the snow that was at issue, but that how could they send the princess to such an awful place? She might not have received any other marriage proposals, but this was too much. The princess asked in surprise, why did he think there were no other offers? The servant crumpled the cloth of the plaid in despair and said bitterly that our princess, the whole world knows that she will not ascend the throne even if the cancer whistles on the mountain. His face expressed despair, but Canola still thought that did he really mean to insult her? But Oscar kept on grumbling, saying, can an old and sick man withstand such a cold wind? And at these words Canola shuddered and said that he was not really worried about her. An old woman sitting near Canola couldn't stand the thread and said, why do they need this old man? After all, he is always whining and making a fuss. The old man Oscar did not keep silent, and in response he shrieked, offended that he was called an old man, that the wrinkled witch herself had recently grumbled that his bones were freezing, and a verbal altercation ensued between them. And Princess Canola covered her eyes and thought that their vigor warmed her soul. But it was really very cold in this area, and even the warm cloak didn't retain heat well enough, so she had to shiver from the penetrating cold. She looked furtively out the window and thought that until some time ago, she never thought she would end up in a place like this. In front of her was a completely icy window covered in an unpretentious frosted pattern, just an icy realm, and she thought she couldn't even imagine how it had come to this. Until a month ago, she had a cozy and peaceful life, in her father's beautiful castle where beautiful flowers bloomed, and the sun with its warm rays warmed everything around her. She remembered happy hours of fun with the boys, and the fact that she loved to paint pictures, forcing Oscar and his companion, who were always arguing, to pose for her paintings. And she suddenly thought that creating her favorite paintings would be enough for a happy life. She was so surprised when her father, calling her into the study, informed her of her impending marriage. He handed her a letter and told her that they wanted to make an alliance with their adversaries, and so she would marry the only son of the King of Tripoli. She held the letter in her hands and thought that at least they had enclosed a portrait of her future spouse. Otherwise, the letter only contained a proposal. She knew that she would be married sooner or later, but she didn't realize that she would be informed in this way. It was as if no one cared about her opinion. It was all decided for her, and she had to face the fact. Her sad thoughts were interrupted by a question from an old woman who was accompanying her. She asked if the princess had said goodbye to that crazy man, and the princess replied that his name was Hassan. And the old woman said, what can you do if the only thing normal about him is his name? She asked the princess not to jump to any more conclusions. Canola sighed and said that at that moment he looked amazing, and the old woman admonished the princess to look at Oscar, and she added that a good name doesn't make a man good. And he in turn snapped at her, saying that now it was clear why such an old witch was called Angelina. And that remark brought a smile to Canola's face, and she thought again about the fact that she had really tried to break up with him. However, she had thought he would be the first to leave her. After all, Hassan was planning to study in another country, and he didn't think she would be the one to initiate it. And she thought it would be better if he had rebelled against her wedding. Had he only asked that she marry to get away from him? But Hassan thought too much of himself, and she thought he was so pathetic. Though she covered her eyes thinking that even she wouldn't dare cross her brother, and she thought that everything still seemed so unreal to her. At that moment there was a knock at the window of the carriage by which she was sitting. She opened the window and was told there was a problem. So Canola squinted against the bitter cold and asked what was wrong. The young man said that a wheel had come off her golden carriage. Canola looked at the broken wheel and asked why it was in such a state, and the young man replied that the roads were too rough and the carriage could not bear the journey. Canola thought she knew she was in for a rough ride. Her older sister had given her such a thing before she left. There was nothing they could do under such circumstances, so the princess offered to get rid of the carriage. But old Oscar vehemently protested that she was traveling empty-handed as it was, so let it be. Suddenly there was a loud bang somewhere nearby. The princess was frightened and wondered what it could be, if they were being chased by mercenaries. But at that moment she was interrupted by the exclamation of old Angelina. She was shouting at the top of her voice that the carriage was really made of gold. Oscar expressed doubt that maybe it was just gilded, but Angelina told him to go and see for himself. And Canola said again that they should just throw it away. But the young man standing next to her said that since it was made of gold, they should take it to the carriage. And he added that it was very cold and she should go back to the carriage. Canola made no objection and actually walked back to the carriage. She took hold of the door handle and her gaze came across movement ahead of their path. She looked more closely in that direction and told Rudek that if her eyesight was correct, there were people approaching them on the road. Indeed, in the distance, a group of riders could be seen through the misty haze. Without turning round, Rudek shouted over his shoulder for the princess to get into the carriage, and he would go and check what kind of people they were. Canola thought that she was almost last in line for the throne, so no one would send so many people to get rid of her. And there are hardly any brigands in these snowy mountains. Suddenly the thought struck her that these men wanted to seize her and demand a ransom that would be enough for the rest of their lives. Terror gripped her soul. She turned to the old woman and asked who she was talking about, and Angelina said that Rudek had told her about him. And she added that the man had come to meet them. She said he was riding ahead of everyone else, and Canola turned her head to look. A rider approached them. He didn't introduce himself but asked if she was all right. Canola noticed that he had glowing snow-white skin, white hair like snow, and green eyes like two emeralds. He was beautiful. She was struck by a hunch that if this man was really her future husband. She even opened her mouth in surprise. Angelina whispered for her to make a more majestic face and stop staring. But Canola stood staring at the prince as if mesmerized, and did not react to her words. Angelina was shocked to realize that their love-struck princess had fallen in love again. The old woman couldn't believe her eyes, and Canola asked her, confused, what should she do? She said that she seemed to be in love. The princess was bewitched by his beauty and thought that such a man would be her husband. Angelina and Oscar were shocked by such a statement. Had she fallen in love again? They boarded the prince's carriage, which was more equipped for a region with such a harsh winter. Canola, after a brief silence, pronounced that she couldn't do that. And Angelina asked what she was talking about, but the princess turned sharply towards the door and said that she must speak to him face to face. But Angelina clung to her and demanded that she bear with her and dare not stick her head out. It's not decent. The old lady declared that even though she had fallen in love at first sight, she had only met him today. But Canola asked, what was the big deal? She just wanted to talk to the man who would soon be her husband. She said that because he had provided them with such a warm carriage, and agreed to haul that junk, the golden carriage, which had already been loaded onto a wagon. Not to mention the fact that he'd come to meet her. And that was the main argument. And she stood waiting so long for her future husband to be done with his business, and she would have a chance to talk to him. Their conversation eventually ended with him sending her to the carriage before she froze completely. Certainly his silent appearance is incredibly masculine, but doesn't he want to get to know her a little better? Old Angelina told her that had she already forgotten her parting with Mr. Heeson. Canola asked why she was suddenly talking about it, and Angelina told her that she had fallen in love at first sight too. All she could talk about was how handsome he was. And she asked the princess how it ended. Besides beauty, there was nothing worthwhile in it, was there? But Canola stubbornly replied that things were different now, and added that this man was the one she would marry. Isn't it strange that she fell in love with him? Angelina looked at her ward and thought to herself, how could she be so optimistic? And she asked why only she was the only one who fell in love then. Canola asked in surprise that who said she was the only one in love. Angelina said that while she was away, Canola had probably received a declaration of love from her future husband. Canola turned to Oscar and asked, she's not scary, is she? And is it possible to fall in love with her at first sight? The older man replied that why would she ask him that? And he looked at her and said that their princess was the most beautiful in the whole world. And he added that she was very sweet, charming and kind. And after a moment's hesitation, he lowered his eyes and added that it was only in their eyes. And this aroused Canola's indignation. With indignation, she shouted out what was wrong with her. At that moment, there was a knock at the carriage window. Everyone turned to the window to see who was knocking on their door. It was her fiancé. He asked if she had some kind of problem. Canola opened the door and said she wanted to talk to him. This surprised the young man. He looked at her incomprehensibly with his emerald eyes. And Canola said they hadn't even introduced themselves properly yet, and she told him to get in the carriage. He apologized and said that strangers arriving in Tripoli must first present themselves to the king. For this reason, the knights could not introduce themselves to them. But she objected that, however, he had gone out to meet her, and he replied that it was because it was difficult to cross the snowy ridge in Charlemagne's carriage. It's not only cold, it's also extremely dangerous. There are lots of wild animals around, so they decided to meet them. She wanted to say something more to him, but suddenly some knight turned to the prince calling him Husa, and said that he should lead the men. And the prince answered that he was going. At the last moment, Canola asked that Husa was his name, but he replied that it was just a nickname, and he added that he really had to go, but he didn't have time to finish, so Canola bent over and grabbed his sleeve and said one more question. The prince was amazed at such direct behavior from his bride. She said that he had just said that the snowy ridge was dangerous, and looking into his eyes, she asked that he was not a knight. Then why did he go with the others? After all, he is the only son. He took her gloved hand in his, and Canola felt her hand tremble at the touch. The prince had said that a man who could not even protect his wife would never be a knight of Tripoli. And looking at the blue-eyed princess, he added that they had a long way to go before they became official spouses. And looking at her with a sad look, he said that however it was his duty to protect her. He closed the window of her carriage and drove off ahead of the column of carriages, and Canola stood for some time longer thinking of his words. Then she turned to the old men who had accompanied her, and said cheerfully that she had told them that she was not the only one in love. Angelina turned away from her and looked out the window, thinking that their princess only wanted to hear what she wanted to hear. Suddenly the princess became serious, and thought about what his words about the long journey meant. These thoughts occupied her mind for a long time. There was another knock at the window, and the princess looked at her subject Rudek in surprise. Noticing her confusion, the young man informed them that they had arrived. She looked out the window and saw the entrance arch of a large castle in front of her. It was Tripoli. She looked out the window and doubt and uncertainty appeared in her eyes. She stretched out uncertainly, saying that this was Tripoli. People looked at them unkindly. She hadn't expected to be greeted with flowers and such, but she certainly hadn't expected such stares, radiating anger. Canola asked her companions Angelina and Oscar sadly, asking if they thought the atmosphere was oppressive. She wondered what she could have done that she was not welcome. Oscar couldn't help but sneer that maybe her bad reputation had got here too. Canola got angry and asked irritably, what did he mean by that? And what did her reputation have to do with it? But Oscar didn't cower and raised a finger up in the air and said that spoke volumes about the rumors of her love affairs. This caused an argument to break out between them. Angelina tried her best to talk some sense into them. Rudek came up to the carriage and said it was time for them to get out. He helped her out of the carriage by giving her a hand. Next, her future husband told her to follow him, and they walked along the red carpet to the entrance of the palace. Canola followed the prince, followed by the old men who accompanied her and Rudek. Inside the palace, the vaults were so high that the building seemed to have been designed with the expectation that the inhabitants of Tripoli had stronger physiques. Compared to Charlemagne, the ceilings here were higher and the corridors wider. The door opened and the prince announced that the guests had arrived. It was unclear to Canola who he was addressing. They entered the hall and she saw him. Her future father-in-law, the ruler of Tripoli. He was an old man. He sat on his throne with his hand on his head. The look in his red eyes was not one of joy. He didn't say hello, didn't introduce himself, only asked dryly that these were all the arrivals. And the prince replied that they were. Then the ruler of Tripoli, Diraz, said that it was less than they had invited. Canola smiled and thought that simply no one wanted to go to Tripoli, and she was just about to explain something when she was cut short, and King Diraz waved his hand and said they could go. This was completely unacceptable to Canola. She stiffened at such treatment. Behind her, Angelina and Oscar were shuffling around. They didn't know what to do, and Angelina was the first to break the silence, saying that maybe they should go first, and then, but Canola stomped her foot and tried to draw attention to herself. She could not allow such neglect. Everyone stared at her. It was a challenge. It was not customary to defy the king's will here. And when all eyes were turned to her, she curtsied and introduced herself as the fourth princess of Charlemagne, Canola Incana Charlemagne. And looking at the surprised prince, said that in Charlemagne, it was etiquette to introduce oneself on first meeting. She shifted her gaze to King Diraz and continued by saying that she didn't want to dishonor her homeland. She was a princess after all. And smiling the most radiant smile, she said that they must understand her act. The king of Tripoli and Canola stared at each other with their eyes fixed on each other. It was as if a silent duel was taking place between them. A whisper spread through the room that she was acting like that because she didn't know much about Tripoli. The prince looked at his fiancée in surprise and thought that to think that someone could talk to Diraz like that. He thought he should take her to her chambers before she provoked the king's anger, but he didn't have time to say a word. King Diraz pronounced that he was a descendant of Tigrago Gregford. He introduced himself to her in return, and that was something out of the ordinary. Canola smiled again and thanked him. She said she was not quite his daughter-in-law yet, but would the king allow her to address him as her father? But the king looked at her sternly and said that she was not yet a member of the Tigrago family. The prince trembled and pressed his lips together. The princess thought it was so rude too, and she had come such a long way for this family. She furtively looked at the prince and thought that they send a proposal first without thinking about anyone else's wishes. And now they were acting like nothing had been decided. She didn't like it. She turned away and thought with annoyance that she couldn't go back without once being on a date with this handsome man, and she noted that he was just glowing. The king looked unfriendly. His gaze seemed to say that she had forgotten her place and openly expressed that she was not particularly welcome. But she strained like a string, cheered up and without pausing before His Highness said with dignity that she understood what he meant. Canola said that apparently he meant to say that she was the Princess of Charlemagne, and smiling added that they would therefore treat her as an honored guest of Tripoli. Again there was silence and the servant said he would escort her to her chambers. Canola realized that the greeting was over and turned to leave the hall. There was nothing to add. The prince looked at her. He wanted to say something comforting to her. He took a step intending to see his bride off, but he immediately heard a sharp call behind him. The king asked Husa to stay. He turned to the king and his father asked him to stay for a while to discuss some business. He dared not cross his father and agreed with his head bowed. The castle was huge, and after a long passage they finally reached the chambers assigned to her, and the servant said he would call for her assigned maid and asked her to wait a while. When they were alone, Angelina expressed complete delight at her behavior. She said she was touched by her resilience and confidence in front of them, and she added that she had expected nothing less. Oscar, too, was delighted by their lost looks. But Canola was of a different opinion. She covered her face with her hands in despair, holding back her sobs. The princess, unable to hold back, burst into tears because she had disgraced herself and didn't know what to do about it. How to get out of this situation? She sat down and wrapped her arms around her knees, trying to calm down. Canola decided that now they hated her at first sight, and continued to complain about her bad temper. Even Rudek tried to reassure her that she hadn't said anything wrong. Oscar, who had been teasing her all the way, supported Rudek, saying that even if she was facing a king, he had no right to behave so rudely to a princess of another country. And Angelina confirmed in a commanding voice that the princess had said what she had to say. She calmed down a little and said that, however, because of her words, she might be sent back. But Angelina said indignantly that how could that be possible, and added that, on the contrary, everyone must have fallen in love with her determination. Canola was still a little hesitant but still asked, was she really cool? And the old guys didn't fail to assure her that she was more gorgeous than ever. Their support finally gave Canola her confidence back, and she said it was her charm too, so it couldn't be helped. She looked around and pronounced that would she really have to stay in this room? The room she was led to did look gloomy. The walls and the decoration were in dark colors, and Angelina hesitantly stretched out that indeed it was darker and narrower than they had thought. Canola walked over to the bed and took the bedspread in her hands. It was black in color, and she said that how could even the bedding be such an oppressive color? Angelina, for her part, noticed that there was no decoration in the room, only the most necessary furniture. And Oscar said that the servants' quarters didn't seem to have been taken care of either, and Angelina exclaimed in surprise that it couldn't be. Canola sat down on the bed and crossed her arms over her chest, thinking about the fact that these people had followed her this far, and they didn't even have a place to rest. How was she going to tell Tigrago? Would it make things right? At that moment there was a knock at the door. Everyone turned to the door and Rudek asked who was there. Behind the door a woman's voice answered that she had come to see the Princess of Charlemagne. The door opened and a slender, tall girl entered the room. She was dressed in a long white robe. Her black hair went down to her waist and her violet-colored eyes sparkled with a secret fire. She said hello, calling Canola. Your Highness. The princess had been warned that a maid would be arriving soon, but who would have thought she would be so beautiful? And Canola covered her mouth with her hand in delight. Looking at the beauty's detached gaze, Canola wondered if the people of Tripoli were all so categorical, either very intimidating or extremely beautiful. There's no other way. The maid, seeing the confusion on the princess's face, asked if something was wrong. Canola asked her how to address her, and the girl said her name was Tibicina. The girl smiled and replied that the princess could address her as she pleased, and Canola thought that her smile was simply dazzling. And the girl pronounced that if the princess didn't mind, she could give her a tour of the castle. But they were suddenly interrupted and the girls looked towards the door in surprise. The Prince of Tripoli was standing in the corridor, and he declared that he would do it himself and show the princess the castle. He came closer and asked Canola if she was okay with such an offer, and the young princess smilingly said she had no objections. The prince looked coldly at the servant girl and pronounced that she could go. She agreed and nodded her head in deference, turned around and left the room. Canola looked at her puzzled and wondered if in Tripoli, a maid didn't need to accompany her everywhere. But the prince distracted her from those thoughts by saying that they could go then. They walked down the corridor and Canola asked how she could address him, and he replied that she could call him Husa like everyone else. Canola remembered that he had said it was his nickname and asked what it meant. The prince looked at her and replied that it meant heir to the monarch. Canola looked at him and noted that his gaze was sad. She thought that was their word for crown prince, and she said she would not like to address him in that way. And she added that it would be better to call him by his first name, for she was the one who would stand beside him. He gave her a puzzled look and she asked that did the laws of Tripoli dictate addressing him by that particular title. Husa turned away and said there was nothing wrong, it was just... He fell silent. Then he added that it was just that no one called him by his name. Canola noted again that his gaze had become sad. She would even say unhappy. There was such sadness in his look that she thought she should not have started this conversation. So she said hastily that she would address him as Husa in that case. But he said she could call him by his name. And looking at her again, he said his name was Adele. And then Canola held out her hand to him and offered to formally introduce herself to each other. She said that she was the fourth princess of Charlemagne, Canola Incana Charlemagne, daughter of Stoka Ingru. And smiling her radiant smile, she added that she was now his bride too, that she would soon be part of the Tegrago family. The prince hesitantly held out his hand to her in return, and when he took her palm in his, he pronounced that he was Adele, the heir to Tripoli. Canola thought that she had taken his hand with such difficulty that she should never let go, and she intercepted his palm more comfortably and squeezed it tighter. Adele was discouraged by her action. His pale cheeks flushed slightly. He watched in amazement as his fiancée performed this manipulation, and Canola held her hands tighter together and asked if he would give her a tour of the neighborhood. Suddenly she remembered something and, taking out some document from her inner pocket, asked Adele if he could check it out. She handed him the paper and said it was a document confirming their engagement. Adele ran his eyes over the text of the document, and Canola asked that it wasn't fake, was it? And he replied that it was a real official document. Canola breathed a sigh of relief and said that everyone was looking at her so much that she thought something was wrong with him. She added that she had been greeted as if she had come here to declare war. Adele remembered that the atmosphere was definitely unfriendly. He remembered his father's words about her not being a member of the Tegrago family yet. He wondered if he should comfort her, but he decided no. No matter what he did, nothing would change. I don't care what it's about. Not now, not in the future. He looked at her and said he was curious about something, but at that moment Canola was trying to fold the document, but she was having trouble with one hand. And he said he thought it more convenient to let go of her hand to fold the document, and he unclenched his fingers. But Canola stretched out uncertainly that if she let go of it, and stopped talking. But the prince said she could then take his hand again. And she said in surprise, really? And he wouldn't run away anywhere if she let her go. It sounded ridiculous. He asked why she felt that way, and Canola replied that maybe he was uncomfortable. Adele thought that since she realized that, why was she acting like that? But the princess's next sentence surprised him even more. She said that she shouldn't have acted like that, knowing how he felt. He shuddered. Did she really know? But Canola laughed and said she just didn't know he'd reach out, and the tension released the prince a little. And Canola added that it was still the responsibility of the one who fell in love first. She also said that she did not want to do anything against his will, and asked him to tell her if he felt uncomfortable. She also said that she did not want to do anything against his will, and asked him to tell her if it made him uncomfortable. The prince took a step and said that she shouldn't worry about it so much because they were already engaged anyway. Canola ran her fingers between his and intertwined them in a locking motion. She said it was the day they'd first met. Next, she brought his palm to her lips and kissed him, confessing that she had fallen in love at first sight. She looked into his surprised emerald eyes and said that it was a pity the same could not be said of him. And she added that she would very much like him to fall in love with her, and promised that she would do her best. It had been 3 days since they had walked around the castle. Canola rested her head on the table where she was eating breakfast and sighed sadly. She said she had even confessed her love to him. Suddenly, she cried out that how could he go away and leave her? Angelina listened to her attentively, and the princess asked her if she knew how the prince reacted to her confession. And when the old woman asked how, she remembered the look in his eyes. He was looking at her so strangely. You couldn't tell what he was thinking from his gaze. And then he just said he understood. Canola was consumed by hysteria again, and she said that was all he said. And she asked Angelina if she thought it was too much. She rested her head again on her folded hands on the table, and said that this indifferent answer was so much his style that she couldn't even object. Angelina was careful to say that in some ways such a reaction is quite delicate. The other residents look at them as if they had robbed them. Canola looked at the engagement contract again and said it was real, so why would they dislike them? Oh, and she had only just arrived here when Adele went hunting and still hadn't returned. A question came from the door asking if she could come in. Canola perked up a little. The voice was familiar. She went to the door herself and, swinging it open, exclaimed joyfully the name of Tibusina. Yes, it was her. She smiled sweetly at Canola and asked how she was doing. She added that the princess hadn't been seen all this time. Tibusina wondered if she was ill, so she came to visit. Canola was happy for the girl, but her mind told her not to get too excited. And she wondered what Tibusina had said to help her adjust to life in the castle, and she wondered why she hadn't come all this time. Tibukina told her that she decided to be careful because Husa seems against it, and she added that seeing her joy, she thought she had done the right thing in coming to her now. Canola said that she had observed the people here and asked Tibukina that she wasn't a servant here at all, was she? The princess added that there was still too much she didn't know about this place. Tibukina confirmed her guess by saying that she was not a servant, but it was her duty to help Canola get used to Tripoli. But Canola wanted to get to the bottom of who Tibicina really was, and she asked that if she was not a servant, then was she an aristocrat working in the castle? And the girl put her hand on her breast and said that she was a temple servant. And she added that, as far as aristocrats were concerned, she thought that the most appropriate title in Tripoli was Raiden. And she clarified to make it clear to Canola that, simply put, there is a Diraz in Tripoli, or in other words, a king. There are the Radines, the blood relatives who serve Diraz. And then there are the Grasses, which are the warriors who stand in defense of Diraz and the Raidens. Canola looked at Tibocina and thought that apparently it was time to study, and she wasn't happy about it. And Angelina, who was standing next to her, seemed to read her thoughts and whispered that apparently it was. Tibicina was a clever girl, and said that gradually the princess would get used to it and promised that from now on she would come every day and explain a little. And Canola smiled and said that she would be very glad. And she took Tibicina's hand and said that maybe they could start training tomorrow, but for now they could just walk around the castle together. And seeing the disapproval in Tibicina's eyes, she whined about how she'd been sitting in the room for 3 days, and it felt like she was starting to slowly rot. And such a childish reaction from the princess made Tibocina smile, and she agreed, asking where she would like to go. Overjoyed, Canola said she would be happy to go anywhere. At this time, in the snowy, rugged mountains, Husa and the other knights were finishing their hunt and going home. One of the knights, rubbing his frozen body, said that they were really going home. It seemed that the hunt had been particularly long this time, and his partner replied that they had been ordered to catch twice as much game as last year. So there's nothing to be done. And looking at the packed wagons, he added that thank God they had completed the task. The first knight agreed with him, saying that last year they had caught an infection, and he thought they were all finished. Another knight came up to them and asked them who was the reason they had survived. And he added that if Husa had not found the cure, he was interrupted by one of the knights, and looking at Husa said that now it was Husa who wanted to go home as soon as possible. And the 3 of them drove up to Husa, and one of them said that he had heard that he had been made a confession on the first day. And Husa said unhappily that Aina had already told everything. The prince, without looking at the knights, replied that he would think what was the point of it. He was silent for half a word. And the knight who spoke behind him asked that he hoped that Husa had not answered that girl in the same way. He was silent, and then he said that a letter had come from Aina. A hawk had brought it. The letter said that Tibicina had been sent to the princess from the temple, and someone behind him said that surely the most capable person had been sent from the temple. Husa was silent. His gaze waned. There was doom in his eyes. He closed his eyes as if tired and said, "That's right." And because of his powers, he was silent again. He remembered the golden-haired girl who had so tenderly confessed her feelings to him, and thought that Tibicina would force Canola to leave this place as soon as possible. The knights called out to Husa, but he did not answer. He was absorbed in his own thoughts. The first time they met, he thought she was an unusual person. She shone with an extraordinary light of kindness, though he was well aware that her confidence was based on ignorance. But he remembered when she had kissed his hand and confessed her love, and for a moment he thought she would make it work. Like a girl with a smile and hair reminiscent of the bright spring sun, could possess such dazzling eyes the color of winter cold. Her image settled in his heart, making him shrink at the memory of her. He gripped the reins tighter and thought that it was useless to try to separate her from the temple now. It depressed him. He remembered Tibicina. He knew that the temple had already made a decision, and that decision made his heart ache with despair. Tiraz would not resist the decision made by the temple. His support was not even to be hoped for. Therefore, these feelings he had for her meant nothing. With these sad thoughts, the sun appeared in the sky, as if urging him not to be discouraged, and blinded Husa, and he had to cover his eyes with the palm of his hand. He looked through his fingers at the blue sky, where the sun peeked out from behind the ridge. Its radiance was blinding, and he remembered Canola at once, her so radiant smile and her words of recognition, and her words of hope that she wished he could love her too. She was like the sun in his life, scorching with love and unattainable. He clenched his fingers into a fist, and he thought that in any case, this engagement would be broken off. And at that thought, his heart shrank with unbearable anguish. At this time, Canola and Tibicina were walking around the palace. Canola had an easy temperament. She was easy to be with. She was always chirping about her life. Tibicina was rather surprised when the princess told her that she had come here without knowing the name or face of her future consort. But Canola only laughed merrily, as if it were an exciting adventure. And Tibicina asked, "What do you mean it didn't happen by her wish?" But Canola replied that isn't that what happens to all members of royal families. But Tibicina remarked that it was hard. Tibicina crossed her arms and clenched her palm into a fist. She pronounced that a princess shouldn't do things she didn't want to do. Canola looked at her in surprise, and Tibicina continued that by obeying the whims of others, one would end up hating those people. And Canola pronounced that from the outside it might seem so. But she added with a laugh that, however, she loved life too much to hate anyone. And she added that, by the way, Everywhere they went, there was gloom. Tibicina paused and pronounced that in Tripoli, practicality comes first. Canola thought, there aren't many buildings here. Because of their similarity, they even blend into one big one. The engravings were only in the audience chamber. Outside, there were only blank stone walls. Even portraits of members of the royal family are rare. Tibicina said that Tripoli was not like Charlemagne, so she might find everything here rather boring. But Canola argued that it was beautiful in its own way. They reached a place where Canola had never been before, and she asked Tibicina where they were. It was a rather foggy place. The trees stood covered in hoarfrost and snow, and Canola thought that was the atmosphere here. Is there really some sort of graveyard here? Tibicina said that they were in the garden. And sadly, she added, though no one was tending it now. And Canola breathed a sigh of relief that it was not a burial ground. Tibicina went on to say that the man who had created it couldn't handle the frozen ground, and she added that perhaps... She hesitated a little, but said that the ground had not taken the man's heat. Canola looked at this frozen realm and thought that it had been a long time since she had arrived here, but she hadn't even seen any trees, let alone flowers. She remembered Charlemagne and pronounced that however severe the climate might be, the place must not be so sullen. Tibicina thought for a moment, then said that the princess was a very marvelous and warm person. She added that she was more and more inclined to think that she didn't belong here. Canola looked at the girl standing next to her in surprise. She was astonished that she had said such a thing. But Tibicina lowered her eyes to the floor and said that she thought it would be better for Canola to go to a more suitable land, somewhere where the princess could receive the love she deserved. She said that the princess had already seen for herself that the people of Tripoli are closed-minded, distrustful, and don't like strangers. Canola is a newcomer. Because of this, the population is hostile to her. And she finished by saying that rudeness could be used as a reason for breaking off an engagement. It would do no harm. Canola stood so stunned by her words that she was even speechless. She had no sooner been accepted than she was about to be thrown out of this land without even trying to understand what she was like. But she gathered her thoughts and replied to Tibicina that she would not deny her awesomeness. However, Tibicina was still wrong. And she stated that she wasn't warm at all, she was just trying to be. She turned away from Tibicina and said that of course she was displeased with people's behavior, but not enough to break off the engagement. She looked at the frozen tree and pronounced that if her words about all strangers being disliked here, and not her specifically, were to be believed, then she should understand what that was about. Tibicina said sadly that she liked the princess a lot and hoped she wouldn't lose herself. But Canola, as enthusiastic as ever, smiled radiantly and told her not to worry. People don't change so easily. And she added that she would always be true to herself and thanked her for her concern. But that was not what Tibicina wanted. She had to push the princess to break the engagement and leave Tripoli. She clenched her palm into a fist, trying to suppress her emotions, and said that the sullen nature and alienated people of Tripoli would make her life difficult. She went on to say that the princess doesn't know how cruel this country is to people she doesn't covet. Canola turned to her and to end the conversation said that she couldn't go back to Charlemagne, and she blurted out that Adele was her love at first sight. And at that moment she had such an enthusiastic and happy face that it seemed as if the ice blocks around her were about to melt. And she added that she even promised that she would make Adele fall in love with her. Don't sincere love and adversity make a person stronger? And this sincere display of feeling and the enthusiasm with which she said it made Tibicina look at Canola from a different perspective. This was not an easy girl, and she would not be so easily driven out of Tripoli. Just at the mention of Adele's name, she began to glow, and it seemed that no hardship could break her or her faith. And Tibicina thought disappointedly that indeed, how does she remain so unwavering? Looking at the princess, one gets the feeling that she doesn't care at all about her words. She seemed to be a warmer and more charming person every time she looked at her. Tibicina clasped her hands together and thought that this was exactly why Canola didn't belong here. She realized she had to be tougher. Her gaze became heavy. Everything was colored in dark tones. She called out to the princess, bringing her back from the dream world. And when Canola looked at her, she immediately realized that the atmosphere had heated up. And Tibicina said that the heir to the ruler of Tripoli is the country's staunchest warrior. His mate should match him and be the same. Strong in body, wise and well-read, and with a righteous heart. And she added that the temple believes that a stranger cannot possess such qualities. A shadow fell on Tibicina's face, and she continued that if suddenly a man who did not fulfill these conditions took the throne, the gods would be angry and take back all the love given to them. Her shadow covered Canola's face, and in that shadow the princess's eyes glittered brightly with heavenly blue. She is Tibicina, the high priestess. She worships the gods of all things, and prays for the prosperity of Tripoli. She has been sent to check on the princess to determine if the betrothal will take place. And Tibicina pronounced that Canola must prove to her that she possessed a sufficient set of qualities to join the Tigrago family. While Canola walked with Tibicina, Rudek asked for an audience with Duraz. He said the people's behavior was illogical. He wondered if Duraz was getting away with it knowing this, or was it just a coincidence? and he added that that was why he had come to him. Diraz looked at Rudek and repeated the word, which illogically. Then he turned to Husa, asking what he too thought was the problem. Husa remained silent. Then he said he didn't think so. This surprised Rudek, and Diraz remarked, "That's how it is." And he added, addressing Rudek, that they were treating them with all their heart. Rudek tried to object, but Diraz interrupted him by asking if he was responsible for transporting the princess's belongings. And he asked that he should then tell his master that they had checked everything, but there was not even half of the dowry they had agreed upon. And he said menacingly that it was now up to them to decide on the marriage. His red-colored eyes did not bode well. The audience was over and Rudek left the hall. Husa, alone with his father, said that the princess's belongings were enough for half the capital to survive the winter comfortably. He asked if they would give her their word. But Diraz asked him in return, how would he explain everything? That the lousy older brother had skimped on the dowry. And the father looked at his son and said that even if she brought twice as much, the temple would not give permission for the marriage. Husa was silent and Diraz said then let her negotiate with them herself. That was the end of the conversation. As always, the temple would not accept a stranger. Tubachina will force the princess to leave. Nothing will change even if you give her a chance. Such unhappy thoughts lingered in Husa's mind. He left the hall and walked down the corridor, continuing to ponder that Diraz had agreed to this marriage after all. Probably because of Tripoli's poverty. Suddenly Rudek appeared in front of him, and he turned round sharply and said that he had been waiting for Husa to ask him something. He asked Husa to give him just a moment. In a second, a guard appeared out of nowhere and blocked Rudek's path, covering Husa's. Rudek was taken aback by the surprise. He didn't even have time to blink an eye, but Husa commanded Aina to step aside, and the humble servant bowed to do the crown prince's bidding. And Husa turned to Rudek and said that he could talk while they walked down the corridor. And Rudek, thanking the prince for his kindness, did not waste any time in asking that all the things sent by the first prince were really part of the deal. And Husa replied that Charlemagne was the first to propose marriage, and also it was they who appointed the dowry, and Diraz agreed. And he added that they received only a princess. After that, Husa said it was his turn to ask questions, and he asked that Canola had been kicked out of Charlemagne. Rudek felt uncomfortable saying such a thing about his princess, but he answered sincerely that he didn't know for sure, but it seemed to be the case. Husa turned away and said that he didn't think she was bad enough to deserve that. And then Rudek said in an angry tone that of course not. He added that it was the other way round. The problem was that everyone adored the princess. So he thanked Husu for taking his time and answering his questions, and wished he could keep the prince. When he and Aina were alone, the guard said that the prince had just returned from hunting and needed to rest. But Husa said the guard's name, making it clear that he would decide when to rest, and asked how the princess reacted when Tubachina revealed herself. Aina exhaled and said that Canola had asked Tubachina to be gentler since they were acquaintances. Husa hummed and a faint smile touched his lips. He was glad that Canola had answered like that, and he thought it was no wonder why everyone loved her so much. At this time Rudek came to Canola and tried to explain to her that this engagement was pointless, but Canola was busy with a book and couldn't understand what he was talking about. And Rudek persisted in explaining to her that the first prince had deceived them. Angelina said, turning to Oscar, that Rudek was talking nonsense and demanded that he stop. Oscar tried to protest, but Canola jumped up from the table and said no buts, and she added that it was the first time in a long time that she had pulled herself together and sat down to study. And she asked Rudek if he was going to get in her way. And without waiting for an answer, she slammed the book shut and exclaimed that please. Finally, she decided to study, and they can't even support. She turned sharply and crashed face first into someone standing behind her. When she lifted her face, she was face to face with her future husband. He looked at her and asked if she was okay. Canola blushed with embarrassment. She didn't understand why he was here, and was worried about how much he had heard. The prince noticed her embarrassment but didn't understand what caused it. Canola said that she thought they wouldn't see each other today, because after the hunt he had to rest for at least a day. Ina, who was standing outside the door and had heard the whole conversation, thought that he had told him the same thing. But Husa said that he wanted to know how she was doing here, and Canola smilingly replied that it wasn't great at first, but thanks to Tibacina's help it got better. The prince was surprised that she was grateful to Tibacina, and asked that did not the princess know that she had been sent here to appreciate Canola. And the girl replied that she does know, but at the same time she is helping her get settled in Tripoli. And she held the book out in front of her, and said that thanks to Tibocin she had been able to borrow it from the library. She also learnt the reason why he had left her and gone on such a long hunt. Adele asked her what book she had chosen in the library, and she said that for starters, since she didn't know much about the area, she decided to choose a lighter first book. And with pictures. And then, from behind her back, Oscar added that it was more accurate to say that there were only pictures. Adele tried to hold back a smile when Canola called out to the old man, and he asked if he could choose more appropriate books for her. And he added that it wasn't enough to apologize for failing to look after her properly, but if she minded. But Kanola didn't let him finish and asked him excitedly that he was asking her out on a date to the library, and she quickly said that they would spend today in accordance with Adele's wishes. Aina stood outside the door. He pondered whether he should intervene, but Rudik came up and said that the princess had no bad intentions. She had only fallen in love. He also said that as soon as she realized the situation, she would come to her senses. He added that it would not take long and asked her not to stop her from living peacefully only until then. And looking after the departing pair of lovers, he said that in any case this engagement was doomed to failure. Aina too looked after Adele and Kanola, and had his doubts about the failure of the engagement. It was the first time he had seen his husu like this. The way Adele was looking at his fiancée said that wasn't entirely true. She was completely absorbing his attention. He hadn't seen his husu like this before. They came to the library and Kanola couldn't hide her surprised exclamation that this was really the whole library. Scared her so much that she was afraid to even come in here. But she wondered how big it was. And she was annoyed. The library was so small that they wouldn't even have any privacy. Adele said that their country had not been formed that long ago, so there were few books. And Kanola said she understood. He asked that she had really come knowing nothing, and Kanola was quick to say that there were hardly any people in her country who knew anything about Trapole, and no books either. The prince turned away and pronounced that he was not reproaching her. Naturally, she is not aware of it, and it is not such a thing as is necessary to know. But Kanola went up to him and said, looking into his eyes, that she was very curious, and asked him to tell her, and she added that she was going to live here. And that's why she wants to know about this place. And also, she stopped talking and then poked him in the shoulder with her finger and said, smiling about him too. Adele opened the large book and began the story. He said that their homeland was the plains north of Edessa. They belonged to a tribe of nomads. At first there were a handful of communities, so dispersed that they could hardly be called a people. He jabbed his finger at the map and said that this was the Grantonia mountain range, north of the so-called Snowy Range. Edessa. And he said Tripoli is here. And he explained that it is not shown on this map, but it is at the foot of the mountain range. Kanola asked in surprise that how come people who originally lived on the plains moved so far into the mountains. Adele said that the war for Edessa had influenced it. They were chased through a mountain range. Eventually they were left there. That's how they settled here. It was the birth of Tripoli. The people banded together to survive in the mountains. A strong ruler periodically led hunts to feed all the people. This continues to this day. They killed as many animals as they needed to survive the winter. That is how many God allowed them to kill. Kanola thoughtfully asked, is that why they reject foreigners? But Adele, covering his eyes, objected that war was a thing of bygone days. But any other story involving strangers always ended in misfortune. And he added that the temple called it an omen of a snow-covered ridge. They say it is proof of the danger of outsiders sent by God. And everyone agrees with this opinion. He turned away from Kanola, unable to look her in the eyes. He was afraid she would give up the fight. And she said it might be isolation too. She asked, what if this faith, supposedly created to drive away enemies from outside, on the contrary only imprisons everyone and causes them to starve to death? Adele put the book down and said that her words were just a hypothesis. In comparison, the faith they retain is the strength that helps them survive in this place. Adele looked at Kanola. Their gazes met. His emerald and hers sky blue. It was a special gaze, penetrating and deep. Kanola smiled and thanked him for his explanation. He looked at her radiant smile, so sincere and sunny. He lowered his head, and she asked him why he didn't tell her about himself, and he replied that he didn't have much to tell her. Kanola sat down on the bedside table and asked, it wasn't that he didn't want to tell her specifically, was it? He looked at her and the princess asked that she was in too much of a hurry, and without waiting for an answer said that she would wait then, and added that their speed was a little different. He turned away and Kanola said she could tell him about herself, and asked if there was anything he wanted to know. But he said no, and wanted to say it was all right. But after hesitating for a moment, he said there was one thing he wanted to ask. Kanola thought she felt like they were getting closer. Adele turned to her and asked her why she had been banished from Charlemagne. She was surprised, and Adele, seeing her confusion, said that if she didn't want to, she didn't have to answer. And suddenly Kanola uttered that she seemed to have fallen in love with him once more, and thought to herself that he was so interested in her. And then she said that the reason is actually very simple. She's the easiest target, and it seemed to her that she was the easiest to deal with, since she is the furthest member of the royal family from the throne. And even if not here, she'd still have to go somewhere else. And she said optimistically that it could be said that she was the one who ran away, not the one who was kicked out. And after thinking for a moment, she added that she had escaped here in order to survive. If it wasn't for this marriage, maybe the older sister would have stepped forward and dealt with her first. I'm sure her older brother sent her here for his own gain. She thought he was pretty sure that without any information, feelings wouldn't arise, but her portrait had been enough to make Adele fall in love. And he knew her very well, Canola. She jumped down from the bollard and approached Adele, saying that he had recently said that the people of this country had fled to survive. So she has something in common with him? Adele looked at her with widened eyes and thought that from the beginning he thought she was unpredictable. But how could she think of such a thing? Canola interrupted the silence and asked if she could ask him for something, and added that it had to do with her hobby. Adele hesitantly asked what she wanted to ask, and Canola replied that if he wasn't busy, could he model for her? Her request was so unusual that he didn't realize what she was talking about, and Canola, with a conspiratorial wink of his eye, pronounced that however much she might think of the first painting in Tripoli, and after a short pause, she said she wanted him to be in it. She decided to paint a picture and asked him to be her model. Tibucina went to Canola but was told that the princess was now with Husa. This did not please the high priestess of the temple. The two of them were bonding, and that could not be allowed to happen. Rudek, who was watching Tibucina, noted that she seemed upset, and he said he would tell her about her visit. But the girl replied that there was no need and that she would come tomorrow. But at that moment, Canola came up to them. She was glad to see Tibucina, but she was afraid that the exam would be now, and she said that Tibucina had not given her time to prepare. But Tibucina pronounced that there seemed to be a misunderstanding, and the princess didn't quite understand the point of the test. Canola pronounced that she actually thought that Tibucina would not come again. After those words, she said about Canola having to prove herself worthy of being a Tigrago. And Tibucina, seeing the upset face of the princess, said that although it was true, but she promised that she would help to prepare and ask the princess to calm down, because she would keep her word. Canola realized that here divine authority was greater than royal authority, and the confirmation that only the temple could order her and Adele's marriage. They were sitting at the table drinking tea, and Canola thought that according to Tibucina's words, it wasn't that easy to get permission. So she asked her, what were the rules that allowed Tibucina to openly help her? And then she added that it could be done secretly. But Tibucina answered her that she must be near the princess to find her faults. And Canola said that she was so sweet that she could not even be angry with her, and the color of embarrassment appeared on her cheeks. And Tibucina looked at Canola and said that, to be honest, the princess was very funny. The high priestess clearly liked her. And Canola asked that was a compliment, wasn't it? Tibucina asked she didn't like it and noted that she didn't look particularly pleased. But Canola replied that not at all and said she just couldn't understand. Why is it that what Tibucina realized so quickly, the other person didn't notice at all? And she thought of Adela. Tibucina uttered that she would like him to remain in ignorance as long as possible. And Canola asked her to stop saying such cruel words with a sweet expression on her face. But the high priestess said with a smile on her face that if Husa knew how funny the princess was, she would be around her all the time. And then she paused and continued that Canola would not spend time with her. But the princess resented that they were quite different things, and she added that she could always spare an hour for such a beauty. Tibucina turned away abruptly and Canola looked at her perplexed. She did not understand what had happened, but Tibucina said that she could not then give her a little of her time. And Canola smilingly replied that of course, and Tibucina pronounced that she would tell her about last year's tests. Canola said a little disappointedly, "What about it?" And seeing Tibucina's hesitation, she asked bluntly, what was her plan to interfere with her classes and make her fail the exam after all? Canola's wit was unmatched, and she bluntly asked the high priestess that if there were past tests, it meant another foreign woman had tried to enter the Tigrago family before her. Did Adele really have another bride? That question made Tibucina shudder. She said no, but she didn't look at Canola. And she added that it's about a very long time ago, before Canola came along. But Canola's curiosity was not so easily quelled, and she demanded to know who it was. Tibucina was angered by her directness, and to contain her emotions, she clenched her fists and repeated that she would do it again. That she wanted to show her past tasks because she hoped she would give up and go back to Charlemagne. But this statement had already angered Canola, and she was not happy that Tibucina had brought it up again. And she put her hand on her chest and said that she would not give up so easily. But Tibucina could not stand it and interrupted the princess and demanded that she stop this senseless talk. It was so unexpected of her that Canola shuddered involuntarily, and her eyes reflected Tibucina's black rage. The high priestess was indeed embraced with cold fury. Her gaze became unkind and she said coldly that the princess did not understand, for she had not yet come face to face with the people of Tripoli. Canola listened to her in silence, but that didn't mean she agreed with her. Meanwhile, Tibucina went on to say that the princess had not left the castle since her arrival. Her look became detached, and she said that her opinion would change when she encountered their hostility. She pressed her lips together and looked at the princess, thinking that now she should understand. But Canola was not so easily thrown off the path, and she surprised Tibucina again by saying that she was different. And that brought a look of bewilderment to the high priestess's face. And Canola smiled and said that Tibucina was friendly with her, even though she was a stranger. And the girl bowed her head and said that it was enough that the others were aggressive against the princess. She added that she did not have to join them. After such a show of kindness, she couldn't even imagine what was going through the princess's mind. She thought she understood everything. But it turns out that Tibukina was wrong. And at that moment, Canola slapped her palms on the table and pronounced that she was ready to meet them, and asked Tibukina to show them to her. Those hostile people she was talking about. There was so much determination in the princess's eyes. She didn't look like a funny girl at all now. Her eyes shone with confidence and strength to face this challenge. And looking at her, Tibukina remembered the question of whether she knew what her role was. She stood before the abbess, and the latter admonished her that this was not just a test sent by God, but her chance to prove that she was a child worthy of becoming the next pontiff. She remembered looking out the window at the arriving Canola. This foreign princess was her test. And the prioress went on to say that God's call had touched her, Tibukina, and it was impossible to fail him. And turning away, she added that Tibukina herself knows exactly what it is. It is the single most honorable position, a position in which she can serve God. The abbess approached her and, lifting her face to her own, said that the day of her return after the curse of the foreigners was lifted would be the birthday of the new pontiff. Canola saw the frozen look in Tibukina's eyes. The princess tried to bring her out of her reverie. She put her hand on the girl's shoulder and gently called out to her, asking if she was all right. Tibukina woke up from her memories and pronounced that since Canola wanted to see the hostility of the humans, she would introduce her to the 5 Husa warriors, and added that there was no one in Tripoli who regarded her with as much caution. And that sounded frightening. She told him that Adel has 5 knights near him whom he trusts more than life. They are selected at the moment when the future ruler becomes Husa. They are with him both in sorrow and in joy. Never betray and always very faithful in their service. They are called temples. There were 5 of them. All of them were young and strong knights like Husa. Aina just got back to the room where the Hus lived. He was greeted by the twins, Tugel and Ram. They reproached him for being late today. They asked him if he had been too relaxed after missing one hunt. Aina sat down on the bench and said that Husa had gone to bed just now. Both Tugel and Ram asked in surprise, "Why only now?" Opposite them sat Ulan and Ladak, who asked that did the conversation with the stranger take too long. And Tugal asked that he meant the night of the princess. But Aina bowed and replied that that conversation was quickly over. And Ulan asked in surprise what was the matter then. Aina replied with a detached look that Husa was with his fiancée. The image of a young golden-haired princess with an angelic smile and their Husa appeared before the knights. The astonishment was of such force that their cry shook the guns and armor beneath the wall. Ulan, who had been sitting there before, jumped up and asked if he had imagined it, and Ram said that he knew that this hunt was longer than usual. Husa must rest. And they all jumped on Aina with one voice, reproaching him for what he was doing. And Aina replied in a low voice that he was a knight who had his back, and there was no question of blocking his way. But his brother knights chided him that his mouth was for what? Only for food. And Aina objected that he had spoken, and he thought to himself that Husa had never yet delayed resting after returning from a hunt. Husa's physical energy was different from other knights. Rest for him, not a choice but a necessity. Aina thought that tomorrow was the start of his normal routine, and that was why he had to get a good night's sleep tonight. And if Husa only fell asleep now, he will consequently rest half as much as usual. Ladak asked why he suddenly decided to meet his fiancée. Aina replied that about that. And he told me that they had gone to the library together to pick out books for the princess. Ladak asked, wondering if he really liked her that much, and Aina threw in irritably that he didn't know that. And somewhat more calmly added that he had not personally heard his words, however, and he thought it was not necessary to tell the others about the changed atmosphere between them. So he only said that the princess was in love with him. And it's obvious. Ulan said there was no need to worry. She's a foreigner. He added that Husa would certainly not marry one. Aina glanced at him but said nothing. Ram and Tugel began to argue that the temple wouldn't change its mind, would it? And one of them thought that maybe the princess had been sent to frame Husa. Aina watched all this in silence. But the next moment he was asked why he had told them of his suspicions, and he replied that it seemed to him that they too should know how Husa felt about the princess. They still had time to ask what for, as the gold of her hair flashed into the room, and Aina uttered that then, that right now this princess is coming here. And all the knights except Ulan turned towards the entrance of the room. At that moment the girls entered the room and Tibukina said just as everyone gathered, and Canola, holding her under her arm, said her name uncertainly. Aina was the first to speak, saying that the training ground was not a passable courtyard. The first to speak was Aina, who said that the training ground was not a passable courtyard. And after a pause he added that strangers were strictly forbidden to come here. His speech was accompanied by the same barbed and unfriendly stare. But Tibukina smiled and said that she was Husa's fiancée, and she was allowed. She stood behind the princess and put her arm around her shoulder to cheer her up, and said that they didn't seem to know each other yet, so that's why they were here. and she leaned slightly towards Kanola and told her to introduce herself. But as Kanola hesitated, she said that she was Husa's fiancé. And Kanola stood thinking that she had heard that in Tripoli, for the most part, all the people were tall. But having met them face to face, they seemed to look more like bears than people. Kanola had a special way of thinking, and so when she said, after asking Tibusina, that it wouldn't tear, would it? The priestess couldn't understand what she was talking about. And the princess pointed her finger at Ulan and said that his shirt ... it felt like it was going to rip. And she added that they all looked so muscular. And realizing that she was shamelessly looking at the knights, she said that it was a compliment and she was in no way going to flirt with them. And Tibusina covered her mouth with her hand to hold back a smile at the ridiculousness of the situation. And Kanola went on to say that in Charlemagne, praising looks and strength was quite commonplace. And finally, she said that she was only loyal to her fiancé, so they needn't worry. Ulan approached her and unceremoniously asked her what she had already seen. But Kanola countered him that just as Tibusina had said earlier, that she had come to say hello, not to look at them. But he asked that she had really traveled this far just to exchange greetings, and Kanola smilingly replied that yes, for they were the closest warriors to Adele, and added that they would see each other often. Ulan flinched. He said, shifting his eyebrows, "Why are they?" Then he cut himself short and demanded an explanation as to why the princess was calling Husa by her first name. But Kanola did not cower before the formidable knight. She only stretched out what it was. She thought there does seem to be something about the name, though it's not spelled out anywhere, but it's definitely something of an unspoken law. It bothered her. She remembered Adele saying that there were no people who called him by his first name, at which point she put her hands to her sides and asked pretentiously, "What do you mean, why?" And menacingly, so that no one else would have any questions or doubts, she said that Adele had said so. And she had his permission. Ulan, standing in front of her after her angry tirade, thought that somehow it seemed that way to him. Kanola turned to Tibusina and said that she knew how to observe the rules of decorum. She asked Tibusina to confirm that she was speaking correctly, and someone spoke up, saying to Kanola that this was coming from a man using disrespectful language to a priestess. And he asked that she knew who was before her, and Kanola replied that this girl was sent by the temple to get rid of her. And besides, Tibusina is her only friend who cares for her here. Ulan exclaimed indignantly that how could she be her friend? But one of the knights put a hand on his shoulder and said enough was enough, thus urging him to stop. It was Ladakh. He approached and loomed menacingly over her and introduced himself, saying his name was Ladakh. Next he introduced the others. First Ulan, who had conversed with her before, and then Ayn, and he bowed his head respectfully in greeting. Next came the Ram and Tugel twins. Kanola smiled and said it was a pleasure to meet you, and she wanted to introduce herself, but Ladakh interrupted her and said they were not interested in her name. Kanola stared with widened eyes in surprise, and he went on to say that there was no need for them to know him, because they would never address her by name, and added that if she understood everything, she could leave. There was a pause. Ulan and Ram looked at the princess in silence. Tibusina also stood silent. The look on her face was sad. Kanola was a kind girl, and she didn't want her to experience this rudeness. And Kanola looked at them and, recovering from her first shock, asked, "What if she didn't want to leave?" Ladakh turned gray with anger and yelled, "What did she say?" But Kanola didn't budge and politely inquired that had she said anything disrespectful? She said she was their Husa's fiancé, and that means she is of higher status. And such a statement made Ladakh come to his senses a little. And on top of that, she said that even with all that, she treats them respectfully because they don't know each other. And she asked that he feels some tension between them too, doesn't he? And Ladakh asked, what does she demand to be treated as superior? But Kanola put her hands together in front of her and said hopefully that wasn't the point. She just wanted to be friends. And that takes time to get to know each other. And she added that he seemed like someone who didn't care about other people's pasts. And she asked that so why is he so irritable? And this remark caused the other knights to laugh. And she walked past Ladakh with her head held high and said that she now knew their names, and asked that maybe they could finally have a normal conversation. And then she asked that they wait, and turning to Tibusina, asked if she wanted to sit down. The high priestess smilingly said that of course she wanted to. And Kanola said, then let's all sit down and try to be friends. This girl had so much positive energy and charm that the initially resistant knights gave up. And after a while, Kanola listened rapturously to their stories, wondering if it was really true. And Ram spoke so passionately about Husa's exploits that when Kanola was once again surprised, he said that she would be surprised when she saw it for herself. And he excitedly stated that despite appearances, Husa is incredibly strong. He said in a fervor that, for example, he had been on the last hunt, but Ladakh cut him off before he could finish. And Kanola pronounced that could he not interrupt? And she called him a petulant knight who didn't care about other people's pasts. He looked at her unhappily and asked what other strange name she had come up with for him. But Kanola said that he was against being called by name. She added that there were 5 warriors and she needed to be clear about who she was talking to. And smiling at Ladakh, who clenched his fists in irritation, she continued, that's a fitting characterization. Ram chuckled, and tears came to his eyes from the restrained laughter, and he said that she was really unbelievable. And Ulan, who was standing behind him, said in surprise that Ladakh could not answer anything. Kanola laughed a ringing laugh and pronounced that if they liked it that way, let them enjoy it. And an annoyed Ladakh, listening to his fellow knights chatting sweetly with this stranger, wondered when she would leave already. His gaze was sad, and to be honest, he understood perfectly well their feelings at the moment. All the people of Tripoli, without exception, know every fact of Husa's life. That's why it's so interesting to brag about his exploits to strangers. And this stranger is someone who doesn't know Husu, and whatever she hears will be new to her. The princess is the best candidate to tell a bunch of stories and get a reaction to it. He remembered Ain's words that Husa hadn't personally confirmed that he liked her. His words that the princess was definitely in love with him. She really did shine like the sun in Adele's presence, and he clenched his hands thinking that Aina was right. He stood up and said that training would start soon, so it was time to leave. Kanola was surprised, and she said that Tibochina had said that they didn't have training today. And she said that he didn't want to say that Tibochina had lied to her. Ladakh shuddered at her words. He thought he should do something about that formal tone. He said that now that they were acquainted, she could drop the formalities. Kanola looked at him and wondered if he was really ready to drop the formalities. She decided to teach him a little more, and she suddenly threw out her hand in his direction, as if demanding that he keep his distance, and said that she could not speak of intimacy with a man. She tried to find the words, and then she said that he could not be called by his first name. And she asked if she could drop the formalities. And she asked Ser Roma if she was right, and he supported her, and Ladakh thought that Roma was going to have his way with him. And he asked, deliberately loudly, what distance was he talking about? But Kanola said she didn't know what he was talking about. At this time, a servant sent from the temple approached Tibosina and said quietly that he had something to say to her. Kanola, not noticing the change, asked Ser Roma to continue the story. Ladakh rubbed his neck and thought it was pointless to argue with her. Tibosina forgot her amusement and became serious. She asked the minister what he meant by that, and he said, what was she thinking when she was getting close to the princess? Her job was to evaluate. Subjective judgment should not be involved. Tibokina stood up and said that he was absolutely right, and smiling, she added that she had no idea how things looked from the outside. However, even now she was judging completely objectively. At that moment, Ladakh came up to them and said angrily that if she was going to vilify Husa in any way by using a foreigner, he would not stand aside. But Tibosina looked him in the eye and said, why would she do that? The temple is a place that prays for the prosperity of Tripoli, and Tigrago is a blood relative of the monarch in charge of Tripoli. And she added with a wan look that there was no reason for them to feud. Aina came up to them and she asked him that it was so, wasn't it? And Aina answered in the affirmative and said that there was no reason for them to fight. At this time, a joyous Kanola caught Tibokina's attention by asking if she could ask the priestess something. Tibosina walked past the knights and heading towards the princess asked what was the matter. Waiting until she was far enough away, Aina said to Ladakh that provoking the priestess would do him no good. And Ladakh said with annoyance that he knew it. He added wistfully that Husa had forgotten what he had to go through to reach his current position. Aina interrupted him and squeezed his shoulder with her hand. It was a warning. His gaze was cold and there was metal in his voice as he uttered that there wasn't a single person who didn't remember it. He said he understood what he was worried about, but Ladakh replied that whatever choice Husa made, he would follow it, even if it goes against the wishes of the temple. Tibokina was talking to Kanola when a servant came up to them and said she had to go. Kanola asked in surprise where she was going. Tibosina apologized and said that the conversation had been so interesting that she had missed the chance to tell her. There seemed to be urgent business at the temple, and so she needed to return. Kanola said that then she too would return to her place, and Tibosina said that she should tell her servants to come and fetch her. And while they were gone, Tibosina would stay with her, but the attendant insisted that it was time to go. Tibosina turned sharply to him and said that she had brought the princess here, so she could not leave her here alone. Kanola looked at Tibokina and thought that based on the strange reaction of the knights, she would like to know what was going on between them and the temple. However, Tibokina would most likely not answer her. Among the books Adele had chosen for her, were there any that dealt with the relationship between temples and clerics? So she decided to look when she got back to her room. Suddenly there was a shriek from the entrance to the training ground. Angelina and Oscar were looking for the princess, and they had caused quite a commotion. This made the princess blaze with shame, and the next moment she was rushing towards them, reprimanding them for their unimaginative behavior, and rebuking them for their insolence in making noise on the training ground. But her seniors indignantly pronounced that the people here were so high-minded, and they had to find her somehow. But she went on to reprimand them, saying they could have asked someone. But Oscar said they could be knocked out with one punch. They were scared. How could you just pick up and talk to them? But she threateningly said that if Oscar kept talking like that, there would be trouble. Kanola said Rudek is with them. so it's not so easy to hit them. And she added that he didn't take him seriously at all. The knights all looked at Rudek as one, and after Canola asked why Oscar was so downcast, he asked her to end the reprimand. Tibucina said hello and pronounced that thankfully they had found the princess, and added that she was now free to go about her business as well. Canola said regretfully that Tibucina was leaving right now and she was so sorry, and Tibucina said that she had already been delayed so much. It's time to go back. Canola waved her off and thanked her for today, and said they would see each other again. The princess said dreamily that she had to go too. There were a whole bunch more books to read. Ladok was tempted to say, "What is she waiting for?" He barely restrained his impulse not to throw her out of the room himself. As they stepped out into the corridor, Rudek asked the princess if she had managed to get close to the knights, but the princess replied that no, it was not so. And this caused Rudek to be surprised. He asked what then they had been talking about for hours. The princess said, "Is it worth telling what she'd been told about the oh-so-surprising man?" This made Rudek even more surprised. She looked at him and said it was as if they were too sorry to give him to a stranger like her. They told her of Husa's amazing exploits, and she pictured the brave, courageous Adele. After Canola's words, Rudek thought that it looked like they were talking about the engagement, and judging from the princess's reaction, they didn't tell it just for the purpose of boasting about their lord. Rudek saw the looks on the knights' faces as they entered in search of the princess. They were hostile, but Canola spoke of their lord as being so splendid that some stranger was unworthy of him with such condescension as if it were not about her, but about some complete stranger. This girl truly could not bear a grudge, and had no memory of offense. But Rudek was indignant. Wasn't that a bit much? Even taking into account the history of their lands. And he thought, they don't want to give up their princess either. But Canola reflected that she was curious as to the reason for this. Besides, this attitude was not only for her. They were wary of Tibucin too. They came to their allotted quarters and Rudek asked that she had to socialize with such hostile people. And he added that she deserved better. But she turned to him and said with a smile that it was much more comfortable. She was puzzled and Rudek asked what was comfortable. The shrewd princess replied that it was easier to see hatred that was openly expressed than that which was carefully concealed. She asked him if he knew what she was talking about. He was once again struck by her judgment. At such a young age, the princess understood and saw more than was apparent at first glance. He frowned and uttered what he couldn't say before. However, the first prince sent only half of the promised dowry. The princess turned away, and it was not clear whether she was surprised. But she said that she should at least thank her older sister for the golden carriage. At least there was a carriage. But Rudek said that wasn't the problem, and she asked that she could write to her brother to send the remaining half. He was indignant, but the princess stopped him and asked him that he realized what his act would lead to. There's a reason Tripoli asked for such an exorbitant dowry. It's clear they're against the engagement. And she asked that did he think her brother didn't know about it? Rudek tried to object, but Canola went on to say that even so, he had only sent half of it, thereby wishing that she would either die or gain a foothold in the place. At that moment, a familiar profanity was heard from behind the door. Angelina resented Oscar for his behavior, that she had asked him not to do that, but he resented her for being such a baby princess. And a quarrel broke out between them again. The princess looked in their direction and her heart filled with warmth for the only close and loyal people. She turned to Rudek and said that she was grateful for his concern, but even if she returned to Charlemagne, she would not be able to live there as before. For once the engagement is broken, her importance will diminish, and then she would have to go to an even more distant place to get married, regardless of her wishes. And she added that that's why no matter what happens, she has to stay here. She put her hand on the book. She would have to learn a lot and work hard to find the answers to many questions that would help her survive. But she was ready for it. Adele was worth it. Canola remembered the day she had been introduced to Oscar and Angelina, who had accompanied her. They were an elderly couple. Their faces were wrinkled, reflecting all the years they had lived, legs and arms that seemed excessively frail. But their posture was perfect. Neither time nor old age had affected it. Canola thought that they had been serving the palace for a long time. She smiled at them and said that their names suited them well. The old men looked sullenly at their young mistress. Canola said she was sorry that their retirement had been postponed, but if they would serve her faithfully, she promised to give them a good old age. And to be sure, she added that it would be more fun than it looked. The elderly people looked at each other and their thoughts were the same. They thought about the fact that they had always lived under strict discipline, and now a carefree old age awaited them? A doubt swept over them, but when they heard the ringing voice that stood out so prominently against the heavy atmosphere of the palace, they could not refuse. And now they and the young princess have been carried to the ends of the earth into the eternal cold, but they have never regretted a day of being with her. Canola sat at the table. A book was open in front of her. The princess sighed heavily and said that she had never imagined that she would start reading books in her life. Angelina instantly said that she had never finished a book before. Oscar said that she had never read a book halfway through. The princess said that she had read very carefully so that she didn't miss anything. Angelina said that she had been studying for an hour and asked if it was time to rest. But the princess indignantly remarked that they were not even trying to help her, and added that she had to study, and they kept telling her to go and have fun. Oscar remarked peremptorily that she was not studying but drawing pictures. The princess replied that they were not pictures but scribbles. She thought that her first masterpiece would definitely be Adele's portrait, and Angelina said that she had lasted long enough. In Charlemagne, she'd just run off for a walk, and she still insisted on going for a walk, adding that the local scenery was very different from Charlemagne, and she would definitely find something to see. And Canola agreed, saying that the people here were different too. She wanted to see the capital and the small villages, the locals who were so different from the people of Charlemagne, and the places where Adele goes hunting. But she realized that she was going to be tested. Tibocina hadn't come for days, which meant she was making up assignments. Oscar pronounced that the priestess had said it wasn't really an exam, but Canola sadly said that Tibocina hadn't told her how it had happened before. How would she know what the assignments would be? She wondered why she hadn't heard from Tibocina yet, and she only now realized that she had no idea how to contact her. No messenger to send to her, and no one tells her where the temple is. She hoped she wasn't being chastised for wanting to tell her about the assignments. There was a knock on the door and Rudek pronounced that it would soon be noon. Canola thought she might be able to see Adele. He's so busy that he can't even have lunch with her. He participates in open duels every day because he must prove his right to be called the heir to the monarch. These competitions are held so that citizens can see if the Whos can protect them and their country. The bouts start at noon, but first Adele has state matters to attend to. Afterwards, he goes to training and then gets down to business again. He is so busy that he even eats at his desk. At dinner, he chats with the Raidens and discusses the administration of the state, and eventually he goes to bed deep into the night. And she reflected that apparently he only had time to rest after the hunt. Now she felt uncomfortable asking him to meet. And so as not to burden Adele, she started going to the duels. They were held every day. Her appearance caused whispers. People were surprised that it was the stranger. They were surprised that she had come here. Some resented that she had behaved too loudly yesterday, and that all strangers were so fond of making noise. Some said she was shameless, but Canola didn't care about them. Let people talk all they wanted. Suddenly, there was a sudden murmur behind her, and a phrase of surprise came to her that he had really come to see the fight. That phrase made her turn round. There was a look of surprise in her eyes, too. Gragford came to the spectator stand. His face was like a mask expressing no emotion, and he looked at her. And Canola bowed in curtsy to greet the monarch. She asked that he had come to observe what was happening, and added that she hoped he would enjoy it. But he replied that he had been told that for some days now a stranger had been making a mess here, and had been asked to take care of her. It was rude. Even Angelina and Oscar were taken aback by such inattentiveness. But Canola was not long puzzled. She smiled and replied that she had never heard anything like it. And she added that, besides, it could not be called a buffoonery. She was only a bride fervently supporting her groom. The king of Tripoli turned away unceremoniously and walked away without a word. Canola didn't know how to act. She had just thought that everything seemed to be all right, and was about to take her seat when the king turned and asked why she was frozen in place. Gragford added that he had come here to take care of an unscrupulous, noisy stranger, so she would have to sit beside him lest his visit should be in vain. Canola tensed at first, but when the meaning of what he said came to her, she cheered up and thought it meant he was inviting her to watch the fight together. They arrived at the royal box, and Canola thought she had the best view from here, and tonight she wouldn't have to jostle in the crowd, and they would be the center of attention. She thought of Adele and how it still wouldn't replace her feeling at the sight of Adele's focused face. At this time, Oscar and Angelina were hurrying away from the dueling ground, and Canola called out to them asking if they were secretly trying to escape. But she saw that Rudek had followed suit, and she remarked that the sufferings of a mistress were the sufferings of her subject. But Rudek hastened to assure her that it was not so. He had simply realized that no one would harm her, and therefore it meant that there was no need for him to. But he didn't have time to finish his sentence before Canola menacingly stated that the three of them were always leaving her alone, and jokingly added that revenge would be terrible, so they knew it. But her faithful servant said with one voice that it was so childish. She entered the royal box and sat down beside the king. They waited in silence for the duel to begin, and Canola glanced furtively at the monarch. His thick beard and menacing expression only confirmed the image of a cold-blooded ruler. If it weren't for his snow-white hair, she wouldn't have believed he was really Adele's father. And she had the thought that Adele probably looked more like her mother. Sadness came over her face as she thought that, judging by the fact that she hadn't seen her yet, she had left this world early. At that moment, the voice of the commentator opening the duel with the introduction of the opponents reached them. On one side stood a huge man, and he was introduced as Muso, a descendant of Berger, and Canola thought it was not a man but a mountain of muscle. The commentator's voice said that his opponent would be the great Husa, who would show what a real fight was all about. Husa looked carefully around the stands as if trying to find someone, and Canola thought he was looking where she'd been watching the fight for the past few days. She had a hunch that he was looking for her, and she couldn't help but shout for him, wishing him luck. The king looked in her direction in surprise, and when she settled back in her seat, he said it was strange that her arms hadn't fallen off from the effort. But Canola sweetly pointed out that her arms were strong enough for that, and thanked him for his concern. Adele approached the royal box and pronounced that he would defend Tedra's honor. The king looked at his son in silence. His face expressed no emotion, and Canola turned to him and asked his permission to wish Adele victory. She was full of energy and fervor and sincerity, her face flushed with excitement. Nothing of this escaped the monarch's cold, penetrating gaze. Her childish directness seemed to stir something in his soul, and he silently reached forward with his hand, showing that she could do what she wanted. And she came down to him and pronounced that it is said in Charlemagne that a lady's blessing brings a knight good fortune in battle. She took his hand and pronounced that since she was his bride, her blessing should bring him undeniable victory. Adele's eyes widened at the sincerity and warmth with which she spoke to him. There was a care that came from her heart. He could feel it, and he had never felt it before in his life. And Canola pronounced that may her prayer be with him, and she kissed his hand, sealing her words. He was amazed and subdued by her act. She was an extraordinary girl who conquered his heart step by step. He turned and walked to the dueling site, and Canola stared in his wake. And the king of Tripoli looked at them as well, and though not a single muscle on his face trembled, he realized that things were getting complicated. When Canola returned to the king and took her seat, she asked, "What is fair?" Husi's opponent has a completely different level of equipment, and that Grasa is twice the size of Adele. Once again, she doubted whether he was human. Canola continued to sit with her eyes closed, thinking aloud that her wish should protect him from all adversity. And the king thought that the noise seemed to imply that she was talking to herself. Suddenly, she asked him, there was no such tradition in Tripoli. Not a kiss of good luck, of course, but at least a hug. And she thought he didn't even nod in response, and she spontaneously kissed Adele's hand. And she hoped it wouldn't be considered indecent. It might have looked over the top, but, she thought, she hadn't broken any rules. At this time in the arena, Musso brought an axe over Adele and struck a blow, knocking him to the ground. He brought his axe in for the decisive blow and brought it down on Husa with all his might. At the last moment, Husa managed to turn away and the axe blade stabbed deep into the ground. Canola froze, amazed at this development of the fight. She grew cold with horror that misfortune might befall Husa. The king, meanwhile, sat with his hand resting on his head as if nothing much had happened. Canola pleaded because of the fact that today was such a brutal battle, and at that moment the king said that it is not magic or the will of the gods that determines supremacy. He was as calm as if it wasn't his only son fighting for life. Canola looked at him as if she didn't understand what he was saying. She wondered if he was saying anything at all. Adele got up from the ground, his gaze was focused, and the king continued his thought by saying that it was fighting skills that had the most influence on victory. And at those words, Adele leaned on his sword, regained his balance, and rose to his feet. The next moment, he repelled another blow from the enemy. And to encourage her lover, Canola shouted that he would succeed. The king asked her that did she, before leaving, intend to be remembered by all as a noisy stranger. But Canola countered that it was only the sincere support of a loving person, and she added that she had no intention of leaving the place. The monarch glared at her and said, "Is it so hard to keep out of his sight?" But Canola replied that no matter how much he hated the idea of accepting her as his bride, there was no escaping the reality, and the engagement letter was an official document. At that moment, the decisive course of the fight between Husa and his opponent was underway. Canola and Diraz were having a verbal duel. He asked that didn't she know that the engagement had not gone according to plan? Canola in turn asked that he meant the dowry. She knew it's less, that the eldest prince had only sent half of what he had promised, but she didn't see it as a problem and told the king so. And added that he had let her stay here because he was satisfied with that too. Diraz looked at her silently, realizing that she was not a timid girl, and then said that she probably also knew that the temple had the last word. And Canola, without taking her eyes off the ongoing battle, replied that she knew. That's why she was learning as much as she could. Husa knocked his opponent's weapon out of his hands with another successful hold, disarming him. The king made no reply to her statement. He only closed his eyes as if tired of the bickering. At this time, it was announced that Husa had defeated his opponent. The audience cheered. Everyone was happy about the crown prince's clever victory. At this point, Canola asked the king that the wedding really only needed the approval of the temple. Are there no other obstacles? Diraz glanced at her and asked if she was really so eager to consummate the marriage. And Canola said that, of course. He asked in surprise that Husa had personally authorized her to call him that, and the princess replied that yes. Husa watched anxiously as his father spoke to the princess. What was he saying to her? Was he talking her out of marriage? And the king pronounced to Canola that tomorrow at noon he would send a messenger to her, and he handed her a piece of paper. Canola looked at him and asked, "What is this map and where does it lead to?" But the king had already risen and walked away without saying a word. But Canola did say that she might ask who would be waiting for her there. And he threw over his shoulder that his sister. Canola remained seated, staring intently at the map. Tomorrow she would meet Gragford's sister. She thought it was her father-in-law's sister. Could she call her aunt? She hesitated. And when the king pronounced that she had asked about obstacles, she flinched. And he added that the obstacle for her was Tripoli himself. Nothing more. Nothing less. A shadow fell across his face and his red-colored eyes burned with fire. Canola looked at him with all her eyes. What did his answer mean? Some hidden meaning was in it. He was leaving and she told him to wait and explain what he meant. And the king pronounced that he only wanted to say that in making such an important decision in Tripoli, even a monarch cannot go against the will of the deity. The temple watches over the people of Tripoli and they all follow its will. Canola pondered his words. Belief in the deity must permeate all local life, including everything that happens on the battlefield. But she remembered the king's answer to her question, that it was not magic or the will of the gods that determined victory or defeat, but fighting skills. And she thought she should ask him why he had said that. She was so preoccupied with this observation that she said aloud that it was so strange, which surprised the servants who were watching her. A monarch whose power depended on the support of the temple, who cared for Tripoli with all his soul, answered her in a similar manner. Something didn't add up. She couldn't understand what it even meant. It was the snow-capped mountains of Tripoli, beautiful and majestic views and harsh living conditions. The house was in a deplorable state. There were broken panes of glass from broken windows lying on the snow all around. There were big bloodstains inside. It looked like a battle had been fought here. Tibucina looked at all of this and pain froze in her eyes. She realized that there might be casualties. A servant came up to her and pronounced that people had been found and fortunately 2 were fine. They went towards the victims and on the way Tibucina asked where the people were, and the servant answered that they were hiding in a cave from a black wolf. However, the 2 who were in the house, she asked that there was no grass there, and the servant replied that the father of the family had died last year. The people they found were a girl and a boy. The girl was bitten and the boy was badly injured. The girl saw Tibucina and said that Figrin had protected them. The girl saw Tibucina and said that Figrin had protected them, Behind Tibucina's back stood the temple attendants, and one of them, looking at the wounded young man, said that by the looks of it, there was nothing to be done. Tibucina leaned towards the girl with the young man, and the girl asked that she not help her, but Figrin, she asked for him. He could be an outstanding Gras, and she asked desperately to be helped. Tibucina looked at the young man in silence and realized that there was no saving him. All the people of Tripoli know the rules perfectly well. The servants helped the girl to her feet and led her out of the room. Her heart was breaking at the inevitability of what was happening. She begged for Figrin to be saved. Everyone knows that those who do not benefit society are to be destroyed. The young man realized that his fate was sealed and he asked that his sister Seth be rescued, saying that she was not so badly hurt. And Tibucina put her hand on his head and told him not to worry. The deity of fertility will take his soul. The temple servants stood at the ready. They had their hands on the hilt of their swords ready to fulfill their mission. The young man did not resist or ask for help. He realized that his time was up, and now his life would stop. While the attendants carried out the sentence, Tibucina prayed that he would be granted eternal rest. It was over in a split second. A young life cut short in its prime. Those were the rules. Tibucina and the servants went outside where the other servants and the girl who had escaped were waiting for them. The girl looked at Tibucina. Tears froze in her eyes. She knew the rules too, but the last hope was in her eyes. But looking at Tibucina's sad eyes, she knew it was the end. Tibucina asked one of the attendants about the girl's condition, and he replied that fortunately not all parts of her body were damaged. After the death of their mother, Providence had decided that at least one of them should suffer less. Seth's legs were only injured and Figrin's arms were injured, so he would be easy prey for the wolves. The Grasa had given their lives to save the other 2. Seth realized that her brother was dead. Tears sprang from her eyes and she wanted to run to him, but the attendants pulled her under her arms. To ease the pain of her loss, Tibucina said that her younger brothers had been sent to the temple. She added that she didn't have to worry about them. They would become outstanding warriors. The girl asked what would happen to Figrin, and Tibucina pronounced that he was already a brave Gras, and the deity would not forget their sacrifice. And leaning towards the girl, she said that therefore she should become stronger in memory of it. And turning to the servant, she made a sign to him that it was time to leave this place. The girl was led into the carriage. The shock made it difficult for her to walk on her own. Tibucina also came to sit down and the servant asked that they were going to the temple. But she said that first they would go to the gorge of the rising sun. At this time, Canola was also in the carriage and was heading to the rising sun gorge. She was reading the instructions and didn't understand where she was going or what the gorge was. She was traveling with her escorts and Rudek, and he said that judging by how far away it was, and he surmised that they were planned to be dealt with permanently. Canola said she had that suspicion too, but she hoped it wasn't so. She thought back to how the king had told her that Tripoli himself was an obstacle to her. Nothing more, nothing less. And she could sense an attitude from him. It was like blind hatred for an enemy. But who was that enemy? She asked Oscar and Angelina if they had heard anything from the palace servants. Like that the king's sister was mean and strict, but Angelina said they wouldn't share that with them, would they? And she added that they, as her servants, were also outcasts in the palace. And Canola flared up and said that she was not an outcast. She said that she was a friend of Tibicina's and knew Husa's personal guard. She remembered how she had been greeted unfriendly. And she said with a clenched fist that her husband would soon be king. She remembered Adele, his focused face and the sad look in his emerald eyes. But Rudek brought her back to reality by saying that, to be precise, he was not her husband yet. And this remark made her so furious that she cried out that she would soon be, and they were almost married. Angelina thought they were finished, and Rudek asked her to calm down. There is no telling how this altercation would have ended, but suddenly they were told they had arrived. They all got out of the carriage, and Canola looked with widened eyes at the palace that nestled in the gorge. It was indeed a gorge made up of solid blocks of ice. Canola walked up to the gate and thought it looked incredibly huge up close. The messenger sent by the king pronounced that she might pass, but he himself did not move from his seat. And Canola thought that it looked like he was going to stay here. And only she and the servant who had come out of the castle to meet them would go inside. It was a man with long white hair, and he turned to Canola and told her to follow him. The princess asked warily what this place was and where she had been brought. If she was locked up in this place, no one would ever be able to get her out. The king's messenger looked at her and said that this was the gorge of the rising sun. He added that she would know everything when she entered. The servant that came out to meet him turned and went inside, leaving the princess the choice to go or stay. Canola thought he was very nonchalant. Rudek and Angelina and Oscar saw her off, and Canola thought that if they were looking for advantages, it was a plus that their weapons had not been taken from them. The fortress guards hadn't even searched them. Angelina said to the princess that it was suspiciously quiet, and she covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hold back a scream. Canola also raised her head and froze at the sight of the man in front of her. Rudek grabbed his sword and motioned for the princess to follow him. A man of enormous stature stood before them, but the servant from the castle said that he could not attack them because behind his stern exterior he was a fearful and modest man. He did have a peculiar appearance. Half of his face was disfigured by a large scar. The servant of the castle told the giant that he was Husa's bride and told him to say hello, but the giant shrank back and could not utter a word. It was a young man, but it took all the will he could muster to greet him, and he hesitantly and gingerly greeted the princess and said his name was Yasa. Canola herself had looked at the man with distrust at first. He towered over them, but then she put her hand out to signal Rudek to put the weapon away and said that you can't just point a sword at people for no reason. And Rudek, putting away his weapon, bowed his head and apologized, saying that it had been impolite of him. This confused Yas even more. Canola realized that this was a really kind man and went up to him saying that she was glad to meet him. She smiled at him and said her name was Canola, and her smile made it seem as if the sun had come out of the clouds. Yasa was struck by her warmth and friendliness. No one had ever smiled at him so radiantly, and it won his heart. He smiled back at the princess and a blush covered his cheeks. And he said welcome. The castle attendant watched in silence as Canola charmed Yasa into showing kindness to the freak. But at last she said to him that they seemed to be delayed and asked him to lead them on. And so they went. On the way they met people, children. Canola was surprised to note that for the most part they were wounded or maimed. At last they came, and the castle attendant knocked on the door and said to the one inside that a visitor had arrived. The door opened and Canola saw before her a spacious room and a woman sitting in a gurney chair near the window. The woman was not young. She had long snow-white hair braided and sat with her eyes closed. Canola regarded the woman, but the woman never turned in her direction, never looked to see who had come to her. The pause lingered and the princess said hello, saying that she was the princess of Charlemagne, Canola Incana Charlemagne. The woman hesitated and repeated that she was the princess of Charlemagne. She opened her eyes and they were cloudy. Canola looked at her and thought that this lady was Duraz's sister, and the woman asked what brought her here. Canola was surprised by that question. She noted that there was something wrong with her look, and asked bluntly that she was the king's sister, wasn't she? And thought that the lady couldn't seem to look at her. But the woman suddenly asked that Canola, that she had come here without even knowing who was in front of her. And immediately she said that whatever had brought her here, she didn't have the strength to listen to her. And Canola said that she did not come here of her own free will. She was sent here by Duraz. After these words, the woman rose from her chair and Canola marveled at her tall stature and unexpectedly strong and muscular body, the strength of which could not be hidden even by clothing. And Canola thought that she could recognize her as Gregford's sister at once. But the woman suddenly asked the princess if she was an assassin. Canola didn't even immediately understand the meaning of what was said. And when she did, she protested. waving her hands, saying that she was physically very weak. What killing? But the lady said that means then, the princess will spy on her? Which caused Canola to protest even more. And the princess said that they didn't even explain anything to her when they sent her here. And then the woman closed her eyes and relaxed a little, saying that it looked like that was the case, otherwise she would be dead by now. And she added that Diraz certainly wouldn't have trusted a stranger with that. Canola became uncomfortable with her words and wondered if she was being dragged into the family strife. But the lady brought her out of her musings by saying that she was the princess of Charlemagne, and suggested that since she was here, had her kingdom conquered Tripoli? And Canola said that apparently the lady had been told nothing, and she said that she was Husa's fiancée, and this alarmed the old lady, caused astonishment and anger. She cried out that Canola wanted to say that Diraz had accepted a stranger as his son's bride. Canola was taken aback by the old lady's reaction. She looked at her silently for the first time. But then, as always, she pulled herself together and smiled and said that was it. The last signature on the engagement contract was his, so he must have accepted it. And she thought out loud and said that it was certainly very exciting to come here, even after his approval. But the old lady turned gray at this news and pronounced, "Did that lad really take a stranger into his family?" Her face contorted with a grimace of anger and pain, and she clenched her palm into a fist and it trembled with restrained rage. The servant who stood behind Canola stepped forward and said that the guest was right in front of her. He called her by name. Her name was my Lady Vidium. But she asked what had he not heard? Her brother had agreed to the wedding of Husa and the stranger. Canola watched as Lady Vidium continued to rage with indignation that how dare he, and asked that maybe the temple had burned to the ground, or they had suddenly changed religions. The princess tried to get a word in, but it was in vain. Lady Vidium said that Husa had been through enough already, so what kind of joke was this? And she asked, as if she had come to her senses, who had brought this bride here? Was it Husa himself? But the servant told her that Hamir had brought the princess, and the servant turned to Canola and said that Mir was his younger brother, the one who had accompanied her, and he added that, in short, Diraz alias Gregford was Lady Vidium's younger brother. Therefore, he could not finish, for at this time there was a clinking of glass as Lady Vidium struck her fist on the windowsill and uttered again in fury that Gregford was a lousy man. What impertinence had come into his head to send the princess with Mir? He knew that Huang could not drive him away. The servant finally managed to interject that Canola should ignore the harsh language Lady Vidium was using, and added that she and her brother had always had a difficult relationship. And Lady Vidium said that how could you put such a burden on Husa's shoulders? And she was indignant that Diraz could be called a father after that. Canola and Huang watched as the old lady clenched her fists in indignation and shouted that she would rather go into the mountains and freeze than accept this. And Huang said that he hoped the princess would keep what she had just heard a secret. And Canola thought that even if she told someone, they wouldn't believe her. She wondered if all the locals were like that. Lady Vidium's blindness didn't seem to be interfering with her life at all. So she said she wanted to find out what was going on. The princess said she would have fought too, or at least been angry. And at those words, Lady Vidium and Huang stared at her. Noticing the bewildered expression on the elderly lady's face, Canola said that if she couldn't, she wouldn't. She managed to lighten the atmosphere a little, and Lady Vidium pronounced, pointing to a chair for her to sit down to begin with. She too sat down in her chair and pronounced that Canola must have noticed that she was blind, and so could not give her a proper welcome. And Canola said that then she would sit down herself, and she sat down opposite the old lady. Huang went to make them tea, and Canola pronounced that she did not yet know how she should address a lady, so she used the general rule. Canola, looking at Lady Vidium, called her auntie, and asked that she too hated her for Canola not being from their kingdom. The old lady was silent, and Canola smiled as she asked a question to which the answer was obvious. But Lady Vidium's answer surprised Canola. She said that it did not bother her that the princess was a stranger, but she did not approve of what Diraz had done. And she asked the approaching Huang if he had heard anything about it. No fresh news. Huang placed a cup of tea in front of his hostess and said that it was only said that an epidemic had broken out in Feldi, which could have killed many of the inhabitants. The fire was crackling in the fireplace, and Lady Vidium asked him worriedly, "Didn't Husa find a cure?" And the servant replied that the villagers had been cured, but the Grasa could not hunt for some time. And he walked over to Canola, serving her tea, added that's why Diraz had to double his production. And the old lady annoyedly pronounced that Husa was already very busy, and here was a bride. Canola had been silently listening to their conversation all this time, but now she said that it must be about the dowry. Huang and Lady Vidium turned in her direction. Canola repeated that Diraz had accepted her as a bride because of her dowry, and in the end he received only half of what he had promised, but even that amount would be enough to help the inhabitants. Lady Vidium cut off grudgingly that Tripoli was not a passable place where anyone who paid money could get in. Canola wanted to object, but the old lady cut her off and said that Diraz wouldn't have done the same. Canola looked into the teacup she was holding. Her reflection looked back at her, and she thought that the lady was somehow too sure of what Diraz should have done. She thought he was her brother, but they didn't seem to be in touch, and their relationship wasn't the warmest. They didn't have a heart-to-heart. She wondered why Gregford had sent her here. Canola, calling my Lady Auntie again, asked why she was so sure of that. Lady Vidium clutched the armrest with her hand and said that because that bastard, but she couldn't continue trying to suppress her negative emotions. Her face twisted again with anger, and she continued that he had failed to protect his wife, who was also a stranger. It was a revelation to Canola. She was struck by my lady's words, and her eyes widened with surprise. His wife, Husa's mother. So she was a foreigner? And she introduced a young blonde-haired girl that, like her, had once come to this country. Those were his memories. Husa realized for the first time that he was different from others when he first started studying. All the children were a head taller and bigger than him. He was a small and frail child compared to them. He was small compared to the others, and lost to everyone else in duels. This difference in physical development he had felt since childhood. And to keep up with the others, he had to train twice as hard as the others. It's not so scary to be weak when you're little. It's not so scary to not know something when you're just learning. But when you become an adult, it all turns into flaws. And there's no leniency for weak adults. He realized he had to become the strongest warrior no one could match. It was the only way to survive. And he worked tirelessly, honing his craft until it was perfect. His father constantly reminded him to make sure Adele remembered that victory never comes by itself. No matter how strong he is, it doesn't guarantee victory. Victory is determined by fighting skills. And he added that if he showed himself properly, even the soulless Templars would be no threat to him. After he became an official Husa, he began fighting other warriors. It was both a great challenge to himself and his moral obligation to the residents. After all, they are not only concerned about their ruler's blood being tainted, but the very future of Tripoli itself. Who would like their future ruler to be a foreigner? And in order that their talk that haunted him might subside, he fought tirelessly in duels for a year, as if his life were at stake. And the tougher the fight was, the more he impressed the audience, and his opponents immediately shut up and gave up. So he got rid of the half-breed stigma attached to him, and firmly established his position as Hus Tripoli. And since then, my dad stopped coming to the fights. It was a gesture of trust that everything would be fine without him. This gesture of his father did not go unnoticed, and even the church stopped challenging his rights. And then he realized and felt fully that he was the son of this country, its future ruler. He was a winner, and it had cost him a lot of work and a lot of effort. It was a very unusual feeling. Those who used to avoid and ignore him now began to trust him. He heard how now people were saying with admiration that he was the real son of his great father. It seemed to them that he was a true genius. How could anyone doubt that he was Tegrago's heir? It is true what they say that Tegrago's descendants inherit the genes of the strongest warriors in the world. Look at his white hair and you can tell who his father is. Gregford said there's nothing that Hus can't control. And the moment he was able to bury that alien half of himself, he faced the unimaginable, the arrival of an alien bride. Is the country so rotten that they are once again accepting outsiders? The discontent of the inhabitants had scarcely subsided before it was awakened again. Diraz's monarch father, after all, knew better than anyone how difficult it was for him. Yet he did this to him. Father surprised everyone by unexpectedly coming to the duel. How long had it been since he'd been here? Why did he suddenly appear, and why was she with him? The most surprising thing was that he seated the princess beside him. The commotion over the stranger happened about 20 years ago. Most of the people of Tripoli realized that a similar situation was about to occur. And they remembered everything. They remembered what they had barely forgotten. His origins. Husa was in deep thought, and his knight's call could not pierce the veil of thought. Ulan repeated that the duel was very soon and asked that he was sure he would be back in time. He had no time at all, and he added that they would go to the gorge when he said so. Husa was silent. He seemed to be thinking about something. Behind them, Ram uttered that Ulan is a fool. He doesn't understand at all. Husa himself wants to meet her. Ulan heard this remark and turned round to ask who Husa wanted to meet. Ram wanted to tell him that it was Canola, of course, but he hesitated half-heartedly. Husa sighed and turned away. He didn't want to let everyone know how he felt, and Ram realized this and quickly found a way out of it by saying that he wanted to meet Lady Vidium. Husa drove away from them, and Ulan said that it was true that Husa had not visited Mrs. Vidium for a long time. Ram saw that Husa was moving away and shouted to him not to go away alone. And Husa thought that Ram was right. However, why was the first thing he thought of was the princess? He knew that she had gone to the Rising Sun Gorge, and he was drawn there with an incredible force. At the point where the vast plain meets the sky stands a tall fortress. Behind it is a sheer cliff marking the beginning of a narrow and deep gorge. Anyone intent on capturing Tripoli must pass through this gorge. One day the warriors of Edessa attacked them, but they repelled the attack. And after that they erected a huge fortress in the gorge, and a strong woman lived in it. As soon as they tried to enter the gorge, the enemy was stopped even at the cost of their lives. It was as if the inferior graces who were willing to sacrifice themselves were sent there as if in exile. Husa and the knights raced at full speed towards the gorge. Husa asked when he had last visited his aunt, and Ulan replied that it had been a long time ago, before the spring hunt. And he added that a lot had happened this year and he had been busy. And Husa thought to himself that he wouldn't have gone to see her even today if it hadn't been for meeting the princess. As they approached the castle, Ulan drew Husa's attention to the fact that the princess appeared to have been brought by Hmir. Husa also looked at the royal carriage near where Hmir was waiting. Ram asked, why did His Majesty send a stranger here? And he'd put Hmir with her. And Ulan replied that it was because Huang worked here. Husa rode up to Hmir, and the latter bowed his head in reverence, and Ulan said that if the stranger had come without him, she would never have been allowed to enter the fortress. Ram said in surprise that Daraz had obviously realized that when he had sent the princess here. But still, why had he done it? Husa walked over to Yas and looked at him with an emerald gaze that held a sense of alarm. Yasa pronounced that the princess was now at Mistress Vidium's, and Husa pronounced that he would go to them. He figured that even if he was arriving unannounced, he could always stop by where the princess was. He opened the door and saw the gold of her hair. He thought that the golden hair glistening in the sunlight, the ringing laughter that filled the room seemed to illuminate everything. He thought as soon as he opened the door, he already knew what would happen next. When she would notice him, smile brightly. He stepped into the room in anticipation of her calling his name as if she were very glad to see him. And he called out to his aunt to let her know he was here. Canola turned to him and seemed not to believe her eyes, and he thought exactly what he thought. Her sunny image was imprinted in his emerald eyes, and he thought that now. Canola smiled and said his name joyfully. Her eyes shone with a million sparkling lights. It was genuine joy. She looked at him and he looked at her without taking his eyes off her, realizing that he missed her smile. Lady Vidium broke the silence by saying that Husa had forgotten all about her, and Husa asked her to forgive him for not visiting for a long time, and he asked how she was doing. My lady replied that everything was fine now that he was here, and Canola noted to herself that he was usually terse and stern. And in the presence of her aunt, he smiles ... It was the first time. It was the first time she had seen Adele smiling. It showed that he loved his aunt. Adele noticed her looking at him and shifted his gaze to her, stopping smiling. Canola blushed and looked away, thinking that she had only seen a new expression on his face, but it had made her so excited. Adele watched her carefully. Again, Lady Vidium diverted his attention by asking him to look, and she held out a piece of paper saying that her daughter-in-law had drawn her portrait, and there was joy in the old lady's voice. Husa took the sheet in his hands but saw nothing, and he said incomprehensibly that he could not see anything. Then Canola came up to him and showed him how to look. She said to put his hand on the sheet, and she put his hand in the center of the sheet and covered it with her palm, and added that you should try to feel with your fingertips. Husa glanced at her and watched her furtively. She was holding his hand, and it was especially exciting, as if fire was coursing through his veins. And he really began to feel, it looked like plain white paper, but it was as if it had an outline on it. Did she paint the portrait in this way especially for Auntie? This discovery further confirmed her goodness. He was amazed, and Canola said that of course she wanted to draw him first, but she hoped he would forgive her. And she added that who knew when she might come here again, and smilingly said that next time she would draw him. Lady Vidium was fascinated by Canola, and she could hear from her voice that Canola was very warm towards Husa, and that pleased her very much. She asked Husa if he thought she was as beautiful as she was in the portrait, and Husa replied that she was. And Canola, leaning towards her aunt, whispered what she had said, and that brought a satisfied smile to the older lady's face. Husa watched them and caught himself thinking how beautiful the princess was. This girl who had come to him and shone her light on his life and on the lives of the people she interacted with. Everything about her was beautiful, not a shred of pretense or flattery. She was a ray of light, and he was convinced of that again and again. He gave the drawing to his aunt and said that it was probably time for them to go. Lady Vidium said she understood and added that she had already kept them waiting. She said regretfully that it was a pity that her daughter-in-law was leaving too, and she turned to the servant and said, "Is it so late already?" Huang looked out the window at the sun setting behind the mountains and thought that it looked like sunset was coming soon. But it wasn't that far from here to the capital, so there was no need for them to leave so early. He thought it had been a long time since Mistress Vidium had looked so joyful and peaceful. He looked at this girl that gave joy to his mistress, and he was ready to ask them to stay a little longer. But that was just his personal wish, and he said that there was still time before sunset, however. And he paused. Canola stared at him puzzled, wondering what he meant. Huang continued by saying that he had just been informed that a carriage from the temple would soon arrive. Lady Vidium repeated after him, and her face became sad, as if she knew why Tibicina was coming here. Adele bowed his head as well and thought. It was hard to understand his emotions. Suddenly, the old lady turned to Canola and commanded them to return immediately, much to the princess's surprise. But my lady softened and said that there was nothing good in a sudden encounter with the Templars. But Canola said uncertainly that Tibicina was her friend. And the old lady stretched out her hands and took Canola's palms in her own, and said sadly that the church was best at driving out strangers. This movement did not escape Adele's notice. He glanced at the handshake, realizing that his aunt had accepted Canola. And in confirmation of his thoughts, the old lady said that she was afraid that the Templars might hurt such a kind and soft-hearted daughter-in-law. And turning to Husa, she asked him to take care of her daughter-in-law, adding that the Templars would not leave her alone. Husa looked furtively at Canola, and noted that her aunt called her sister-in-law. It meant that she approved of their union. He couldn't help but be pleased. And he also thought that his aunt was so generous to a stranger, and that Canola deserved this support. There was someone in a foreign land who gave her the respect she deserved. Though it had only been a couple of hours since they'd met. Canola said she didn't think Tibicina was a bad person, but still promised to be careful not to upset her aunt. And Lady Vidium marveled at how beautifully Canola spoke. Adele said they should go then, and the old lady made a fuss that they should go before the church wardens arrived. And rising from her chair, she whispered to Canola one last time about everything she had heard here, and blanched before she could finish. And Canola picked up on her thought by saying it was a secret, and put a finger to her lips as if Lady Vidium could see the gesture. And she asked, what was the right thing for her to understand? Milady was pleasantly impressed by her tact and thanked the girl for her understanding. When they got outside, Ulan and Ram followed the princess, and Ulan asked what Lady Vidium was up to. And Ram admonished him that it was too much of him. But the knight said, turning to Canola, that even they found it hard to call her daughter-in-law yet. And Canola asked him that it was not their friendliness that was the problem. And Ram laughed and said that she had made a good point. Husa and Huang were walking behind them, and Huang said that he had not expected to see Husa here and asked that he had come to collect his bride. Husa replied that it was his duty to protect her while she was in Tripoli. Huang lowered his head and said, that's how it is. Then he added that Husa could not be called a warrior of Tripoli if he could not even protect his own wife. There was something in his words, like some secret meaning or subtle hint. But he quickly turned the conversation in another direction, saying that it was great that the princess was able to lift Lady Vidium's spirits. He added that it had been a long time since she had been seen so cheerful. Husa agreed that this was good, and asked that it seemed that Huang was not going to report it to the king. And the servant replied that Lady Vidium was in good spirits, and he wanted to send the king news that he would like. Things got complicated after losing her favorite estranged sister-in-law. She became angry with Gregford. And because of that, she never left the castle. In addition, young Gregford did not have a warm relationship with his sister. Lady Vidium didn't try very hard to get along with her brother either, and it seemed as if these two would live a lifetime, never finding common ground with each other. Huang thought about the fact that he didn't know with what intention Duraz had sent the princess here, but he knew for a fact that her existence was a new joy for his sister. And also he realized that if the stranger couldn't last here, it would really hurt Lady Vidium. And he clenched his fists and decided that then she should definitely settle in Tripoli. He was willing to do anything for Lady Vidium's happiness. Husa looked over his shoulder at Huang and told him to take care of his aunt. Huang bowed his head and assured Husa not to worry about it. And he said that then they too must get into the carriage, and he turned to look for the princess. His gaze instantly found her. She stood beside Yasa and said something sweetly to him. This girl had a way of warming everyone and winning them over with her light and kindness. He saw her smile and the way her words made Yasa smile. And he wanted by all means to touch her, and to get into that circle of light that was springing up around his bride. He strode resolutely in their direction. Canola heard someone's approach and turned around and cheered. Adele uttered, she was about to go. But as he came towards them, he put his arms round her and pressed her against him as if to protect her from the coming danger. And she did not know what to think, for he had always been more than restrained. Canola looked into his eyes, trying to understand his feelings. His eyes were filled with longing, as if something was weighing him down. She twisted out of his embrace, causing Husa to gasp in surprise. She took his hand and led him away from everyone. He didn't understand what was happening and only asked where she was going and followed her. But Canola moved a little further away and turned to him, taking his hands in hers and looking into his eyes, and said that frankly she had heard from Lady Vidium about his mother. And she said that she thought he ought to know about it. She squeezed his hand and pronounced that Lady Vidium had said that Diraz had failed to protect his wife. She remembered Adele telling her the first time they met that a man who could not protect his spouse could not be called a warrior of Tripoli. Husa looked at her with all eyes, and she continued to speak, asking what was that nice to hear. And without waiting for an answer, I said no. For a warrior who cannot protect his woman, defending the country is an impossible task. But Husa said that Diraz had never had such a problem, and Canola said in bewilderment that, however, the wives... But Adele finished for her by saying he didn't have a wife. Canola staggered at his words and stared with all eyes, trying to understand the... There is no queen in Tripoli. Her throne is empty. She let go of his hand, not realizing how this could be, and Adele explained to her that his mother failed the temple test. Yi had not been approved to be Deraz's consort, and so his reputation was not tarnished by his failure to protect his consort. A shadow lay over Canola's face and only her eyes sparkled just as brightly. She asked, meaning his mum. It was hard for her to find the words, but she did ask that his mum had died without becoming queen, and she added that she had also heard that she had died without passing the test. However, Adele was still recognized as Husa, but the fact that she never became queen just because she failed the test was something she didn't know. Adele clenched his fists thinking of his mum and uttered that somehow, and he pronounced to make Canola realize that his mother did not possess a strong body, according to the temple. Canola listened to him without interrupting, but remembered Tibukina telling her that in this country, the crown prince was the strongest warrior. He needs to match his powerful parents, and his consort needs to have a healthy body, a clear mind, and a holy belief in virtue. And the Templars are not convinced that strangers fulfill these criteria. She was brought out of her musings by a voice announcing that the carriage from the temple had arrived. She heard Tibusina getting out of the carriage call her name, and Canola turned to look in her direction. A friendly, smiling priestess of the temple looked at her. She could see that she was glad to see her, and she said that she had never thought she would see her here. But her eyes changed and became frowning for a second, disapproval flickering in their depths. She spotted Husa next to the princess. At this time, the wounded girl was brought out of the carriage and everyone turned their attention to them. Husa asked, "Are these warriors for the fortress?" And he said that apparently a lot of people had been hurt, and he asked how many survivors. Canola looked at Tibochina expecting an answer, but she looked at the princess and said that about that, but immediately blanched. And then bowing her head, she said that he could find out in the report when he arrived, and added that he was in his study. And she turned the conversation back to the princess with the fact that they had not finished one conversation, and asked when Canola would be able to spare her time. Canola hesitantly mumbled about that conversation about the past, and thought maybe she'd tell her about Adele's mother. She was certainly curious as to why she had failed the test, but right now she didn't want to leave Huss alone. And Canola thought it would be good to hear the story the next time she met Lady Vidium, and she turned round and wanted to go up to Tibukina's. But at that moment, Alel grabbed her wrist and held her back from that step. It was as if he were warning her. Tibusina noticed this gesture on Hu's part. She realized that the bond between him and Canola was growing stronger. Canola looked at Adele, and he looked at Tibuchina and said he wanted to discuss it now, and asked what, or is it something he shouldn't know about? An unkind fire lit up in Tibusina's eyes, but she calmly said she didn't want to take up his precious time. Adele replied sharply that the time he spends with his fiancée is not her concern. Tension rose. Canola was surprised at such an outburst on Adele's part. It was as if he was trying to protect her from Tibukina, shield her from something. She didn't feel any danger, though. And Tibusina bowed her head and said that if he was so interested, it wasn't a secret conversation at all. And straightening up, she pronounced that she would now tell Canola about the ordeal. It came as a surprise to Canola. Not that they hadn't talked about it, but she was somehow unprepared, and she hesitantly said the priestess's name. But Tibusina said that she could certainly refuse, and to encourage the princess, she added that she was on her side. Tibusina said she didn't want Canola to hurt herself doing these cruel tasks, and she continued her speech by saying that if she refused, she would be treated better in the temple than any other visitor. She could look around and do as she pleased. At that moment, a temple attendant came up to Tibusina and called out, and she ended her speech by saying that she would accompany and guide her. And Canola thought, this is how it is. Tibusina is doing this from the bottom of her heart. She was not speaking from the position of a church where foreigners are rejected, but genuinely cared for Canola. And Canola said that Tibusina knows that she will never give up, and that answer pleased Adele. And she went up to Tibusina and thanked him for his concern. And she noted that, as she had thought, Tibusina was not a bad person at all. The princess assured the priestess that she was fine and asked to be told about the inspection. Tibusina pressed her lips together, apparently regretting that she had not been able to persuade the princess to abandon this engagement. But well, the choice was made, and she said that on the first test, you have to prove that she has a strong body. And she said that she would have to get to the top of the Winter Ridge and bring back the Golden Fleece. Even the brave and strong Adele was struck by the weight of such a challenge. When the knights heard about it, they began to talk about climbing to the top of the mountain. Even Husa had never gone up there. How can such a fragile girl go up there? Canola heard them say that there must be plenty of wild animals there too, and she tried her best to contain her emotions. A hurricane raged inside her because she realized that either way, she seemed to be in trouble. The news that in order to become queen, the princess must climb to the top of the Winter Ridge reached Charlemagne. Bergen said that when they were not hunting, they were short of supplies, and the climate was very harsh. And he added that even if strangers were so despised there, to jeopardize the life of a princess who shone like the sun, Canola's older brother took off his glasses. The irritation was growing, but he said calmly to Mr. Bergen that, even if he did, it had nothing to do with him. and the rightful heir to the throne of Charlemagne. Laurel had said in a cavalier manner that he should have shown his ardor when Canola had left. And now he didn't even know if the engagement was worth renegotiating, given the hard work involved. He also said that Mr. Bergen had shown courage when he parted from the princess and told her to her face. But Mr. Bergen brushed it off as a misunderstanding, and he started making excuses that although he had missed the point, but in the Tripoli book. Laurel listened to him thinking he was a jerk, and his patience was starting to wear thin. He looked at Bergen and thought that he hadn't missed a moment, and hadn't even thought of interfering. He's not stupid at all, but even if he could win Canola's heart, it would hardly come to marriage. The only problem was that Canola was a better judge of character than he was, and Laurel Charlemagne pronounced that if he really felt so sorry for her, he could go to Winter Ridge and visit the princess in person. And he added that he would not be dissuaded. To Mr. Bergen it was like a thunderclap. He couldn't believe Laurel was serious. And the elder brother in turn said that judging by Mr. Bergen's words, his sister was given a cold reception, so how could he be calm in such a situation? And he said that surely in many couples girls get more love. And he waved the visitor away and said that it seemed that the conversation was over and said that he could go. He added that he had a lot to do. Mr. Bergen left, and Laurel reflected on his words about his sister's need to conquer the summit of the mountains. He put his glasses back on and sighed. Was Canola really putting her life in danger? That question was unanswerable. The image of his sister appeared before him, and he thought that even if she did, he wouldn't argue. Even if she got in there. The cold snow-capped mountains appeared before him, and he thought, no, this is impossible. It's ridiculous to even think about. He remembered their conversation in the office when she'd tried to work things out. She held a bottle in her hands, which she placed on the table in front of him and said that even so, she wouldn't argue. He looked at the bottle and asked, what is it? Canola replied to him that why would he ask her? Obviously it is poison. Laurel was surprised and took the bottle in his hands. He asked again, wasn't that her doing? And Canola said that if it wasn't him, then it must have been the older sister. It was naive to think that a brother would use such methods. He wouldn't have sent such a callous killer. Laurel set the bottle on the table and thought that even if he had an inkling who did it, should he say, she was almost poisoned and yet she's so calm and carefree, and they say he confessed to everything because he was a coward. It's chaos from start to finish. Laurel asked Canola, who stood before him, if she wanted revenge, but the girl replied angrily that she did not, and asked her not to be dragged into it. They don't even need a reason to quarrel. In any case, he would avenge her in another argument. And Canola leaned on the edge of the table and said okay. And she added that she wanted to tell him that she wasn't claiming the throne. She's not interested. She's not unhappy as it is, so she asked him to let her live in peace. Laurel asked why he should believe her, and she said because he was her brother. And she added that one of the princesses had to marry into a marriage of convenience. And she suggested that maybe they would let her live happily ever after, and then marry her off to a suitable groom. And smiling, she pronounced that her sister was obviously not suited for the role, but she would be obedient. He thought in the end, judging from the fact that that man, instead of using poison, just gave her the bottle and confessed everything, she easily won people's hearts. With that kind of character, she can survive anywhere, and will pull every person she meets to her side. Canola rode in the carriage and Adele rode beside her on horseback, and she looked out of the window and asked him to tell her honestly, is there anyone on the top of the Winter Ridge? Bears and wolves? Tigers, maybe? Adele answered her honestly that she would meet these animals before she reached the top. She asked in surprise that even a tiger, and he replied that if she was unlucky, yes. But wild animals won't be the main problem. First of all, it will be hard to bear the cold. The trail is already uneven and the snow makes it dangerous. Adele looked at her and saw how hard it was for her to control her emotions, and how she held on with all her might trying not to lose her presence of mind. And he said that there was one way to pass this test, and she excitedly asked him what it was. She was eager to grasp it as if it were the last straw, but his answer didn't please her because Adele uttered one word. He suggested to her, surrender. The top of Winter Ridge was the first and last place the heirs of Tripoli climbed when they took the throne. Husa must go to the top of the ridge to bring the golden fleece with which the throne is wrapped. Though it is the wool of the ibex, which dwells in those places, they say a fleece similar in color to gold will do. He figured even the most distinguished warrior in Tripoli could barely handle such a thing. He remembered Tibucina saying that the princess must climb to the top of the Winter Ridge and bring back the treasure, and thought that the temple was giving such a challenge to a foreign princess for one purpose, to make her leave. And Adele said he'd never climb that peak either. Only one person who lives in Tripoli has been there, and that's Duraz. And he added that more than that it was not adapted to the wilderness, and even trying would seem pointless. Even the knights of Husa were upset. Canola asked why he was asking her to give up without even giving it a try, and he honestly answered that it was impossible to do so, so it was useless to try. He sullenly thought that this marriage originally wasn't meant to happen, and his heart ached because he didn't want to let this girl out of his life. Husa clutched the reins at the realization of this fact, and he asked her if she had heard the story about his mother. Canola was staring at him with all eyes, and he apparently wanted to tell her the innermost things. Adele didn't wait for an answer. He continued by saying that she surely knew that the engagement had suddenly been broken off. Canola pronounced that she only knew that marriage could only be arranged after passing the test of the temple. Adele looked at her and said it was deadly dangerous. His mum could have died trying to complete the task and get the temple's approval. Canola remembered that Lady Vidium had said that her sister-in-law's status had passed the test while pregnant, but had fallen off a cliff and died. That's why Adele was born early. They were both fighting for life and everyone helped as much as they could. But miraculously, he was the only one to survive. In the end, Adele had to let go of his mother before he could even see her face, let alone feel her embrace. Besides, Tripoli doesn't recognize the existence of the Stathis. What to speak of the views Adele had to face as the son of a stranger before he was recognized as a Huss.